experience over a long period of time. With that said, my approach and my objective is to be as broad as possible. One of the things that you have to learn how to do when you're running a security program is to adjust and tailor the approach in the program for how things are going to operate within your company. And so for what was it? It was 12 years I was at the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. They are a public health organization. Their priorities are very different than what you would see if you were at a manufacturing company or at a retail company or at a financial services company. Yet at the same time, everything that we're talking about is going to apply to every one of those types of companies because we're going to tailor and customize everything that we're doing. Where you see my biography, the objective is not to say that I'm the best person or the only person in the world that knows how this works. The objective is to highlight that I at least have the credibility and the experience to lead you down a path to success and to give you confidence that I know what I'm talking about based on experience, not based on something theoretical that we read in a book. When you talk about executive cyber leadership, one of the things that I try to avoid throughout the conversation is to talk about the position as the Chief Information Security Officer or the CISO or however else you want to pronounce the letters when they're combined together. In reality, we're talking about cyber executive leadership, where anybody who has a responsibility for cybersecurity is going to contribute to the success of the organization. I know a lot of organizations that have a chief information officer. There might be a head of security or you might have security managers, but there is no chief information security officer where an individual is recognized as a corporate executive and is responsible for cybersecurity. And so having a broader definition of the role and not limiting it to the CISO now opens the door for more people to contribute to the process. The other thing to consider when you talk about cyber executive leadership is that you're focusing more on the leadership part than the cyber part, and you are making sure that the organization is directed and managed by people who understand business leadership, because most of the work that you're going to do in cybersecurity is going to lead to some type of business decision. You'll see in a slide that we'll talk about in a moment that one of the most important things for security people to remember is that risk treatment is a business decision. Whether I was the CISO or whether I was a security manager, regardless of the position that I was in, I've never had the power as a security person to tell the business what they're going to do, how they're going to apply their resources, how they're going to spend their money. It's always an encouragement or decision support approach where I'm providing good information. And based on that good information, the organization understands what do they need to do, where do they need to go, what is the best option, and then they choose the option from the choices that are available. My definition of this is consistent with what NIST says. So if you were at the conference yesterday, we had a great presentation from one of our representatives at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and she and a couple of other people highlighted the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. Within the NICE framework, they have formally documented all of the roles, responsibilities that make sense for cybersecurity people, and each of those roles is then categorized into job functions and knowledge areas that have knowledge, skills, abilities, and capabilities that are formally documented. And so cyber executive leadership is documented as one of those capabilities for executive management. The role of executive management is to focus, as it says on the slide, on decision-making authorities, helping establish the vision and the direction for the organization, specifically related to cyber, resources, and operations. And so now that begs the question, well, what is cybersecurity and how are we defining it? Because this is a learning session more than anything else, by academic definition, cybersecurity is the protection of computer systems and networks from theft or damage. It also focuses on disruption and avoiding outages or any kind of impact to the organization. Now, I was paraphrasing the definition. The definition comes from Wikipedia, but Wikipedia did a good job of giving a broad definition that applies in every context, in every location. The reason that I provide the definition is that part of our problem in cybersecurity is that the language that we use is not the same language as people who work in other business practices. If I go to the accounting department and I start using cyber language and vocabulary, unless they have experience with cybersecurity, they don't understand. Or if I go to business operations, or if I'm in a manufacturing environment and I go to the operations technology department and I'm talking to the chief of engineering, the words that I'm using to describe something are going to mean something completely different. So it always helps to start with definitions. And you'll see as we go through the framework that some of the definitions that we use are valuable because they make sure that everybody is speaking a common language and has the same expectations about what's going to be produced. The same idea that we talk about with cybersecurity also applies to forensic science, as an example. In digital forensic investigation, the word authentication has a completely different meaning than authentication when we're talking about it in cybersecurity. So it's very important in every case, in every situation, when you're building a program, when you're running a program, when you're managing the activities, that people understand what you mean by the words that you're saying. I need to combine people, processes, and technology to achieve the cybersecurity goal that's listed here. And ultimately, that's going to help me understand the risk that applies to the organization. It's going to help me encourage the organization to respond properly to the risk that we're facing, where our responses are to avoid it, to accept it, to mitigate it, to transfer it. And then we're going to monitor the effectiveness of our response so that we maintain risk at an acceptable level. This leads into our second definition that's going to form the foundation of our conversation for the rest of this session and actually adds context and support for the conversation that we'll have after the coffee break as well. When you look at cyber resilience, the idea of resilience is that you have the capability to continue operating in the midst of an adverse event. So that could be a power outage, it could be a cybersecurity incident, it could be a natural disaster. Many of the things that we're doing when we're building a cybersecurity program are going to contribute to the availability of the systems and the services that support the mission essential functions of the organization. Now, because you have limited resources and money isn't unlimited, technology is not unlimited, the availability of people is not unlimited. The reason that I say mission essential functions is important, and it's one of the areas that we want to focus on. You do want to make sure that you're restoring, that you're recovering, that you're protecting the most important items within the organization. This leads into things like crown jewel analysis that you get from MITRE, or it leads into things like business impact analysis that you get when you're doing continuity and disaster recovery planning. But ultimately, you do need to understand what are the capabilities that are critical and what has to have the most resources applied so that we can maintain that capability. It leads us to have uninterruptible power supplies in the data center, or it leads us to have duplicate sites if we're doing cloud services so that I can fail over from one site to another. I know some companies go as far as having different cloud service providers so that if Amazon goes down, they can immediately fail over to Google Cloud, or they can immediately fail over to Azure Cloud. And the more things that they do, the more resilience they have. The challenge is that each one of these choices has a cost associated with it. And our role as cyber executive leaders is to help the organization understand what is the balance between the cost and the outcome that's produced by our spending so that we're doing things that are going to support the organization. With that introduction, ultimately, the thing that I want you to take away from this conversation is that the role of the modern cyber executive is not a technical role fundamentally. It's evolved from a foundation in technology management to a focus on executive leadership and business management. If you go back into history, what you'll find is that the reason that most CISOs report to the CIO is that security started off as a firewall engineer. I think it was back in 1996 or 1997, a little bit before the 2000s and before technology as we know it today was pervasive within organizations. There was no security department and there was little concern about security. Your greatest concern was unauthorized remote access to the environment. And so security broke off as a separate practice. And that new practice was really just an extension of the information technology department. Today, there's a lot more that you have to be focused on and concerned with and familiar with. And as technology has transformed, the complexity of these systems and services that we're using has also transformed. And so, where we started in the 90s with the firewall, now it's cloud services, it's multiple SaaS solutions that are tied together to produce an information system. It's all of the components, the access control, the encryption, the configuration management, and other things that all work together to support the operating infrastructure for our systems and services so that the business can do whatever it needs to do. And so, to be an effective cyber executive, you must focus on the right problem. If you go to business school or if you have a conversation with business leaders, there is a consensus that there are three keys to leadership. Number one, you want to ask the right questions. When I show up to a meeting, if I'm asking the wrong questions, or if the questions don't lead me to the ability to make a good decision, then the organization is going to lose trust and confidence in why are they paying me? What am I producing? What are we going to do for the benefit of the organization? Another key to leadership is removing barriers. In a lot of cases, people see security as a cost center, not because security has a cost and has no value, but because there is a limitation in the way that people communicate the value of security to the organization. One of the benefits of removing barriers is that people start to see that security is there to contribute to the success of the organization rather than being there and creating distractions or slowing things down. Realistically, security should never get in the way. Security has the responsibility to say, this is the situation that we're dealing with based on my knowledge and my understanding of the objectives that you have and the things that you'd like to accomplish. And so putting things in the right context and framing them properly allows you to remove barriers so that you can be an advocate for the business initiatives. And as part of your advocacy, you're encouraging the business to have the right controls in place, to make the right decisions, to reduce risk as much as possible. The real key to the conversation is focusing on the right problem. The right problem is most important when we're talking about cyber executive leadership because your problem is not compliance. Your problem is not security for the sake of security. Your problem is whatever the business defines as its core business objective, the priorities that the organization has, and its strategic initiatives. Once I start to think about all of the business items that are going on within the organization, now I can start to describe the risk that those items are facing and how cybersecurity is going to contribute as a risk management practice to prevent exposures, to prevent outages, to prevent failure of the strategy being executed. Now, this is not to say that the CIA triad is not important. The fundamental goal or objective of cybersecurity is always going to be confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The question is, how do these items in the triad apply in a business context when you are in an executive role and you're communicating with non-technical business counterparts? For academic excellence, just to make sure that we are providing all the right definitions for the conversation, confidentiality is focused on protecting information from being accessed by unauthorized parties. So our primary tool for confidentiality is going to be encryption. Encryption is going to ensure that only people who are authorized to gain access to information are the only people who can do so. A failure of confidentiality is often known as a breach. It typically can't be remediated once the data is breached. It's been breached, and now I can only clean up the situation. We close the gap, we provide containment, eradication, and recovery through our incident response program, and then we try our best to restore operations as well as possible. The issue with confidentiality is that there's no way to hide a secret once it's been revealed, and nearly all incidents reported in the media today involve some major loss of confidentiality. So to maintain confidentiality, we want to focus on things like encryption as a fundamental control, but you also want to think about access control, monitoring, evaluating, and understanding the environment so that you can tell the difference between an authorized activity and an unauthorized activity. And this situational awareness helps you maintain the confidentiality of sensitive data. It also sets you up for success when you get into things like data classification, where some classifications of data require encryption, other classifications don't because they're not sensitive, they're not regulated, or they don't require the same level of protection within the organization. Another part of the CIA triad is just the focus on integrity, where integrity is ensuring that information is authentic, and unaltered and is in the format that it was, where either in the format that it was generated or in the format that it needs to be in to support business decisions. If you were at the Moldova Cyber Week yesterday and listened to my closing keynote presentation, one of the things that I highlighted was my experience with the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and that is a good use case for the value of integrity. When the CDC went through their digital transformation back in 2002 was when it started. One of the issues that we dealt with was that scientists didn't care about confidentiality. They were giving all the information away. There was no need to spend money on all those encryption controls that we were promoting. What they were really interested in was the value of integrity because they do years and years and years of research. Sometimes it's a decade of research that leads to some kind of discovery for health, for epidemiology, for finding the cure to the common cold, or whatever the concern is, and making sure that you have valid, relevant information is of critical concern. Similarly, integrity is going to be valuable for things like the pandemic now, where you don't want people to get bad information that's going to lead to bad decisions that is potentially going to harm people. On a smaller scale outside the scope of the pandemic, healthcare information systems are a good example of something that needs good integrity. Because if I am doing pharmaceuticals and I'm a pharmacist and I'm providing drugs, I need to readily have access to the history that an individual has, any drug interactions that they're exposed to, so that I prescribe the right medicine to solve a health issue instead of prescribing medicine that's going to cause a health issue. So things like hashing, digital signatures, certificates, and non-repudiation are all going to work together to make sure that the information is intact and is satisfying our integrity requirements. And I used healthcare as an example because that's a lot of my experience, but this also applies to websites. It applies to digital signatures on software. It applies to hashing when you download open source code to make sure that what you downloaded is what you expected to get, and that you have a degree of confidence that the software that you downloaded is trustworthy, is going to produce the results that you were looking for, and has not been compromised or altered either in the transmission process, or it was altered at the source and you didn't get what you were looking for. The other area that's extremely important in the triad is availability. Some information needs to be readily available. Like you think about something like the stock exchanges, where regardless of the global stock exchange during the trading day, the exchange needs to be up and it cannot tolerate an outage, because an outage during trading leads to significant losses of revenue. Or you think about availability in a healthcare situation where I need to have the industrial control systems that support oxygen and power for surgeries and other activities that are happening in the hospital. Those things need to be available. I intentionally picked a physical example for availability because everything that we're talking about for confidentiality, integrity, and availability applies in the digital sense, and it applies in the physical sense. And many of your modern cybersecurity executives are responsible for both. I know a lot of CISOs and CIOs and operations executives who work in industrial control systems and manufacturing environments that are applying everything that we're talking about in this conversation to the operations environment that's controlling the industrial control systems and the SCADA systems, which influences safety. And they are as concerned about that part of the environment as they are about the digital environment and the traditional information technology that we're concerned with. As organizations start to adopt smart cities and smart technology and smart buildings and the Internet of Things and the collection of all of the devices that are going to work together to give us more timely information, it becomes even more important that modern cyber executives think about the physical and the digital concerns for all of the things that we're doing, because SCADA and industrial control systems are ultimately going to be everybody's responsibility. Your elevators are controlled by it, your trains, your devices, your telemetry, your HVAC systems, all of those could potentially be areas that are compromised that lead to another attack, or it could be areas that, if they are compromised, causes some kind of physical harm to individuals within the organization. I didn't write it down and I don't have the date, but there is a good example from Las Vegas in the United States where the IoT device that controlled the temperature on the fish tank was the gateway to a breach of digital data within the casino, because it was an open connection, somebody was able to gain access to it. They used that to gain access to the back end IT systems, and then that's how they facilitated the attack. And so we can't just ignore physical systems or IoT systems, but you have to think about the entire context of what we're dealing with. This leads into the next slide that focuses on context as a concept. And the question is, how is the CIA triad relevant in the context of your business? If I'm in an organization, I have to understand how they operate. When I went to business school, everything was related to widgets. And so if I'm in a widget manufacturing organization, I need to understand how the organization operates so that I can then have the conversation about the context and the relevance of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for a manufacturing organization. And so if we start at the very beginning, there are going to be mining systems that pull raw materials out of the ground, then they put them on a truck. Then the raw materials are taken somewhere where it's going to be smelted and melted into raw materials that then end up being put on an assembly line. And on the assembly line, you have all kinds of robotics and other machines that are going to take what was started off as ore in the ground is now going to be a widget that is mapped to a specific size or specification or use case where there are quality concerns and other things. The entire business process of generating the widget is going to have all kinds of risks and exposures throughout the entire life cycle. How do we measure all of the raw materials so that we can estimate how many widgets are going to be produced from the materials that we mined? Or how do we get the materials from the mine to the factory? How do we get it from the truck into the smelting machine, from the smelting machine onto the assembly line? And in each one of these transition stages, what are the safety and security concerns that can be addressed by the controls that we're putting into place? A lot of people in conversation, if you talk to them, only focus on, I know everything about my information security management system and what it took to build the ISMS, or I understand everything about my privacy requirements because of GDPR. One of the limitations in security leadership is that people don't think broadly about the business and then apply all of those things that you know, all of those things that you learned, the items that you spent decades mastering are valuable, but have to be applied to the business context for the organization that you're working in. This is even more important when you consider that most of the people that you're talking to have not spent the same amount of time mastering cybersecurity or mastering the technology that supports the execution of your confidentiality, integrity, and availability controls. This is not just my opinion, but it's also represented in all kinds of studies, reports, and analysis. Some of the items that I'm using in this conversation are annual reports or findings. They haven't come out with the new versions yet. They often come out in December leading into the new year, so we're a little ahead of the curve. But last year in September of 2019, Marsh and Microsoft did a great survey that focused on global cyber risk perceptions. The audience in this survey was primarily executives who were business leaders at the board level or at the management level in large organizations. And one of the findings from the report was that key decision makers are not spending enough time on cyber risk management. What generally happens is that the board has a risk committee, the risk committee has a chairperson, the CISO reports to the chair of the risk committee, and then there is a 15-minute meeting every quarter when there's a board meeting about the cyber risk that exists in the organization and how you're managing it. So for those of you who are listening, if you have been to a board meeting, what you will recall is it is very rare that security has a long, extensive conversation. It's often a subset of the conversation that the CIO is presenting to the organization, or something that is a high-level overview about our compliance status and how we have satisfied regulatory obligations facing the organization. It's very rare that risk management is a focus of the cybersecurity conversation, where you discuss the risks that we're exposed to, the resources that we have, the way that we're going to apply those resources to specific countermeasures. And the lack of that conversation is represented in the Marsh and Microsoft report, where they found that only 17% of executive leaders or board members spent more than a few days over the past year about cyber risk. Even among the IT respondents, where you have CIOs and technology executives, 30% of those people said they spent only a few days or less, which is representative of a 15 to 30 minute meeting 1 quarter per year, And so you're only doing maybe about 120 or 160 minutes per year talking about cyber risk. And then they have delegated that responsibility to the CISO or to the head of information security or to an equivalent role. And they're just getting feedbacks and reports, not really thinking about what do we need to do and how do we need to do it. And so the Microsoft and Marsh survey works as a counterbalance to something that was said by Deloitte and Touche back in 2018, where they highlighted that risk oversight is a primary responsibility of the board, and directors on the board of directors must continually develop and improve practices so that you have a good function. Risk oversight is going to encompass cybersecurity, but it's not only focused on cybersecurity. When you look at things like the COSO framework or ISO 31000, enterprise risk management is going to include cybersecurity risk, operations risk, financial risk, regulatory risk. Every category of risk within the organization is going to fall under enterprise risk management. And this is more what they were talking about in the Wall Street Journal article, but they did have side notes that talked about the role of cybersecurity in the context of the business when they were looking at it at the executive level. This leads next into recommendations from the National Association of Corporate Directors that provided guidance about everything that people need to know, how they need to approach it, and what directors on the board of directors are supposed to be arguing. You know, part of the reason that in my biography I said I'm on a board of directors and I'm the chairman of the risk committee is that the things that I'm communicating to you, again, are not theoretical, but they're things that I've seen in practice. For the board of directors that I'm on, if I were not the chairperson of the risk committee, I'm sure that nobody would pay much attention to risk. I am a unique person in being a security executive who's in charge of enterprise risk management at a global nonprofit organization. But even my affiliations with other board associations, most of the people on a board of directors have financial backgrounds. The most sought after role on a board of directors is a chief financial officer because they're good at financial forecasting and generating positive financial results, especially for publicly traded companies. And so the disparity between the number of financial people and the number of security people on the board leads to having organizations like the National Association of Corporate Directors provide guidance and resources that are going to help boards think about what they need to do. Now, the specific report or the specific recommendation or handbook, however you want to call it, was focused on cybersecurity. It came out, I think it was in 2018, and everybody was very excited about the contents of the handbook. What they probably overlooked was that within the handbook, a lot of the recommendations come from other resources that already exist. So ISO 31000, which is an enterprise risk management framework, really is something that, okay, I just saw a comment. I apologize for the distraction. So ISO 31000 is an enterprise risk management framework. And that enterprise risk management framework describes things that people should be doing that they have often overlooked in practice or in theory. And so the National Association of Corporate Directors did a good job to refine, redocument, and reissue good practices. Some of those good practices are summarized as the idea that directors need to understand and approach cybersecurity as an enterprise-wide issue, not just an IT issue. Directors should understand the legal implications of cyber risk as it relates to specific circumstances. Similarly, on the board of directors level, the board should have adequate access to cybersecurity expertise. In conjunction with that, the board should also have discussions about cybersecurity risk management, and they should receive regular and adequate time on board meeting agendas. As I said before, in many cases, one of the issues that you run into with cyber risk management at the board level is that they're only spending 15 to 30 minutes, often no more than 60 minutes, talking about the cyber risk that the organization is facing, and then having a discussion about the best way to use the organization's resources to respond to the risk. One of the most important recommendations inside the handbook is that directors on the board should set expectations that business management will establish an enterprise-wide cyber risk management framework and make sure that there's adequate staffing and budget to ensure that that framework is executed properly within the organization. Because I work in consulting now compared to my work previously when I was in charge of security for an organization, as a consultant, what I have observed globally is that most organizations do not have enough cybersecurity resources. When I say resources, I'm talking about people. So most of your security teams are very small. The processes are immature because there's not enough budget to buy the best capabilities available. The technology is often immature and outdated. And where organizations are focusing on digital transformation, they often overlook the requirements for maintaining their levels of protection in conjunction with the transformation that's taking place. This leads to the final recommendation that's in the handbook, where the National Association of Corporate Directors recommends that board management decisions about cyber risk must include identification about what risks to avoid, what risks to accept, and what risks to mitigate or transform through insurance, as well as specific plans associated with each approach. In conference after conference, conversation after conversation, one thing that often comes up is the idea or the question about who is responsible for defining the risk tolerance for the organization. The correct answer to that question is that the board of directors should say what risk is tolerable, and the board of directors should provide resources to achieve whatever they said is acceptable. So if we say that we cannot tolerate more than $5,000 worth of losses, the logical question is, how much do we have to spend so that no more than $5,000 of losses are realized if we have a data breach, a cyber attack, a security incident, or some other event within the organization? Now, the handbook provides principles, guidance, and recommendations, but what we recognize in practice is very different as a reality compared to the theory and the recommendations that were documented. As I said before, the recommendations in this handbook came out in 2018, but the same organization that produced the handbook also does an annual study that surveys public companies about their governance. Now, the public company governance survey is broad, it's all encompassing, and is not focused exclusively on security. But one footnote in the report that came out in December of 2019, and the new report will come out in December of 2020, is that 61% of directors on the board of directors said that they would compromise on cybersecurity to achieve business objectives. And so on one hand, you have a document that says all of the great things that the board of directors should do to achieve cybersecurity goals. But then on the other hand, a significant portion of people who responded to the survey said that they're willing to forego those goals and focus on official, true, fundamental business objectives rather than focusing on what is necessary and required for security to make sure that those objectives are met. Now, there is positive news in the report. 61% of the directors said that they would forego security and just do what needed to be done. 28% of the people who responded to the survey did say that cybersecurity was the highest priority above everything else within the business. What I suspect personally is that the people who said that cybersecurity was the highest priority were probably companies in the security services industry, because security is a billion, possibly $1 trillion industry. I think they said that $5 or $10 trillion will be spent on cybersecurity services, solutions, and technology by 2030. And so some portion of the people who responded to the survey must have been cybersecurity organizations. With all of that said, it leads into our responsibility as cyber executive leaders. The key to success for your individual role as a security leader is to have good context and good understanding about your organization. Each of you on the call, whether you're listening live or if you come back and look at the recording later, everybody who is in a cyber executive leadership position, whether you're the CISO, the chief information officer, the chief technology officer, the head of audit, the head of compliance, everybody who is in one of these critical cybersecurity leadership roles needs to understand what the business does, which is why I gave the examples about manufacturing and healthcare. You need to understand the intimate, exhaustive details about how the business accomplishes its mission. With your understanding of how the business accomplishes its mission, you can now start to explore the risk that the organization is exposed to and what might interrupt business processes. Establishing the business processes and understanding the risks that could interrupt those processes allows you to consider the countermeasures that should be implemented. Going back to the conversation about confidentiality, integrity, and availability, I intentionally identified your core controls and the objective of those items in the CIA triad because it was an opportunity to start to reinforce we need to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it and how it applies to the business. When we think about countermeasures, knowing that encryption is your primary control for confidentiality, now in every situation where there is some kind of risk or harm that would be done to the business because we've lost confidentiality, that's going to help us prioritize the use of encryption in the organization. Are we going to do full disk encryption on laptops and mobile devices? Are we going to use acceptable levels of encryption for communication security? Is there going to be some driver that says we implemented SSL years ago, we've never looked at it again? Should we reevaluate and confirm that we've upgraded from SSL to transport layer security and it's the right version of TLS to ensure that we are achieving our encryption objectives and goals within the organization? All of that leads us to start to measure the effectiveness of our cybersecurity strategy. The session that we'll have in the afternoon after the coffee break is focused on metrics, but metrics is your primary tool to verify that your strategy is working because the performance measures that you're generating are going to allow you to describe, are we on track? Are we off track? Are we ahead of schedule? Are we behind schedule? Are we achieving the level of risk reduction that the organization needs to satisfy its objectives and accomplish the business goals and the business strategy? Once you use your measurements and your metrics to answer the question to number 5, that provides the input and the information that you need to justify any spending that you're doing. If I can show with evidence that the things that we're doing are making a difference, my request for additional funding to continue to do what's working is much easier to argue. Or if we notice that the effectiveness of our controls is going down over time, that is a good justification using evidence that we have, using our own metrics to say that our controls are getting worse. We need to modernize the controls. We need to improve the controls. We need to make some adjustment in the process to make the situation better or to maintain the situation at a level that is acceptable. What people often overlook at the business level is that you cannot purchase one control and then expect it to continue to be effective forever because the environment that the control applies to is constantly changing. Systems are being updated, systems are being patched, you're deploying new technology. Most technology environments are very volatile and change regularly, and it requires ongoing investment to allow your security controls to keep up with the changes that are happening in the technology and in the operations environment, and having a good understanding of what's happening and having a good understanding of what's changing and having good metrics to reinforce your arguments is going to help you to justify your spending and your budget requests. Now, when I go to the business and talk to them about the value that security is delivering to the organization, we're in a position to shift from being considered a cost center where people are just providing money, but they see no value or no result, to actually being an advocate and a good partner for the business, because all of the things that we're doing are reducing the risk that the business is exposed to and is helping the business achieve successful outcomes. For the question about the slides, all of the slides that I've shared throughout Moldova Cyber Week 2020 will be available as a PDF, and so you can reach out to the organizers and we'll make sure that you get a copy of them. When we talk about the entire role for cybersecurity leadership or for cyber executive leadership, there are a lot of facets that go into it. Again, my goal is to make sure that we shift our focus from being excellent technology leaders to being well-rounded, fully capable business leaders who have a deep understanding of technology and a deep understanding of risk so that you can communicate risk to the organization, leading to the organization to accept what you're saying and then take reasonable action. This next series of slides focuses on things that must be in place in addition to technical skills. Now, I will never argue that technical skills are not a requirement. Early in my career, when I started doing just technology and security, I think it's been 25 years now, but early in my career, I was an ISDN switch operator. So understanding all of the channels for communications and for coordination and for session management and how all of the network infrastructure worked before we have the easy stuff that we have today in TCP/IP and Ethernet. ISDN was very technical. ISDN was very complicated, but it provided a good foundation for understanding how networks work, how systems are connected to each other, and that type of knowledge is required for everybody who's going to be in this position. The challenge when you get to a leadership role is you have to understand the technical aspects. You also have to understand the business aspects. And one business aspect that is very important is the soft skill that you have to communicate with non-technical business counterparts that have to receive the information that you're providing and have to take some action or make some decision based on that information. And so things like being able to adapt to situations or being flexible or communicating effectively when it's in person and in writing, or because of COVID via a webinar or video conference, your communication skills are going to be very important so that you don't lose things in translation or so that you don't miscommunicate, which is why we started with vocabulary as at the very early part of the conversation. You also want to be adaptable. Sometimes the business is going to adopt emerging technology or new approaches before they're ready, and security should not be in a position to tell the business that they can't adapt something that is going to enhance their business activities. Security has to be adaptable and innovative so that you can improvise solutions that maintain the level of risk reduction and satisfy compliance and regulatory requirements, even when the business is moving too fast or they choose to operate on the bleeding edge of technology. Consistent and accurate communication is important. Being focused, being in control, and having the humility to accept that the business normally was not established just for the sake of doing security, but they were established to do something that adds value to the community, to the world, or deliver some kind of return to their stakeholders. And understanding and humility the part and the role that security plays is also going to be very important. In addition to just soft skills, there are also business leadership skills that need to be available. How well have you mastered strategic planning and strategic management? One of the most important things that a cyber executive can do is align your security strategy with the business strategy. But if you don't understand things like strategy development frameworks or the balanced scorecard or how to develop a strategy map or represent how your security activities are working in conjunction with the business strategy, it's going to be very difficult for the organization to recognize you as a peer, and they're going to continue to place the cyber executive in a subordinate position that does not add the value that really can be added. Thinking about developing a business case or doing project management or developing your staff internally or doing financial planning and budgeting or change leadership or relationship management, there's a long list of business skills that need to be developed and mastered to coincide or work with your technical skills so that you are a complete business leader within the organization, so that you have the respect and the consideration from your peers. Another area to master is just the idea of corporate governance, where governance is defined as the framework of policies, procedures, and approaches that are used to direct and manage the activities of the organization. Inside corporate governance, you're going to have alignment between all of the business units. You're going to have program management. You're going to have control frameworks. There needs to be communications plans. When we talk about corporate governance and its relationship to security governance, there's often going to be some intersection between data classification, asset management, enterprise architecture that you get from the Open Group Architecture Framework or the Zachman Framework. Business continuity planning is an enterprise corporate governance activity that security contributes to, but often doesn't own, metrics and reporting, board communication. All of these items are going to work in conjunction with what you're already doing, especially if you are primarily focused on compliance, security operations, and incident response. You know, when we speak of compliance, another issue to be familiar with is your understanding of all of the legal requirements and regulatory frameworks facing the organization. What often happens is we focus on the payment card industry data security standard, also known as PCI DSS. Organizations become extremely focused on PCI requirements, but they forget about all of the other requirements that the organization is subject to. And so if I am a company that's based in England, I have English requirements, I have European Union requirements, I have requirements for every country that I do business in. It becomes a long list of requirements that have to be satisfied. I do not have the luxury as a cyber executive to only focus on one standard like PCI, but I need to think about how the controls that we implement for PCI satisfy requirements for other frameworks. Things like general data protection regulation are also going to be similar when we go to Singapore and there's a Personal Data Protection Act, or Brazil launched a new privacy regulation in September of 2020. Or in the United States, because the United States has 50 states and multiple territories, you could have a collection of 56 or 57 different approaches for the protection of personal information, in addition to the national regulation, plus every other country that you're operating in. So when you look at getting business skills, one of the beauties of business skills is that the best place to develop those skills is with coaching and mentorship, or you could get a business degree, but there often are not formal certifications like you have in the security profession. A lot of this comes with experience, it comes with reading, it comes with partnering with people who are willing to show you how this works. You know, when we talk about compliance, your general counsel is often one of the best people to partner with, because your general counsel is responsible for all of the legal impacts that result from whether or not you have satisfied the requirements. You know, if you're dealing with financial concerns, your chief financial officer is going to be a good partner, and having good relationships with these other people in legal and finance and in operations, they're often going to be able to tell you, for your organization, what do you need to learn? What do you need to know? What do you need to be familiar with so that you are successful in your role as a cyber executive leader? You know, again, the requirements for a manufacturing organization are going to be very different for a retail organization or a banking organization or a healthcare organization. And talking to your peers within within the company is going to be very valuable to make sure that you are on a path to success, because you have the knowledge that you need to combine with what you're doing. Another area that's important, and this is one area where you can get certifications, is just understanding risk management as a practice. For ISACA, I can't remember the full name of the organization, but ISACA has certifications in risk management, in IT governance, in internal audit. There is an Institute of Internal Audit known as IIA that has good certifications for audit standards. COSO has a certification for aligning strategy with enterprise risk management. And so these are going to be good industry resources that have professional certifications that help you understand at a deep, comprehensive level, how do I do risk assessment? How do I do business impact analysis? How do I do risk analysis and quantification, vulnerability management, vendor risk management, physical security, disaster recovery, continuity planning? The list goes on and on and on for risk management, but fortunately for security leaders, we have numerous standards from ISO. I believe there is a standard from the International Organization for Standardization for everything that you ever wanted to do. Similarly, the National Institute of Standards and Technology from the United States makes available for free numerous standards that describe how to do many things that are going to be valuable. With all of this combined, it leads into starting with good governance, where the definition that I provided for governance before, the framework of directing and managing activities within the organization, is going to play a significant part in the success that you have in implementing all of the requirements for cyber executive leadership. I mentioned NIST because their documents are free and there's no cost associated with them. In practice, when I was a CISO at an organization and currently as a consultant, one of the things that I have found as the most valuable tool to get the entire organization to understand and adopt a consistent framework for risk management is NIST Special Publication 800-39. If you just do a Google search or an internet search for 800-39 and have NIST included in the search terms, it will lead you to a document that focuses on security risk management from a leadership perspective. One of the benefits of this document is the tiered organizational hierarchy that any company can adopt, even if you have an information security management system from ISO, or if you're not doing something that comprehensive and that structured. The benefit of NIST in the 800-39 is a complete description of an organizational hierarchy that makes sure that you're doing good governance at every level of the company. The way that NIST lays things out is in 3 tiers. Level 1 is going to be the executive level of the organization. Depending on the organizational structure, the highest level could be the board of directors, the highest level could be the chief executive officer, the highest level could be something else that I haven't defined, but represents the decision makers who have the ultimate authority within the organization. Whatever you define as the organization level, what NIST describes at level 1 is the perspective for comprehensive governance that thinks about techniques and methodologies to assess risk, methods and procedures to evaluate the significance of risk, the type and extent of mitigation measures, the level of acceptable risk for the organization, approaches for risk monitoring, and approaches for risk oversight. If you can achieve and document these 6 items at the highest level of the organization, everything else that you do in the organization is going to be structured and it is going to be consistent. Now there's no question about do we or do we not accept the risk of performing some action. Currently, I work as a virtual CISO for an organization, and in my virtual CISO role, every time there is a question about security strategy or security risk, even if I'm not making the decision, I'm included in the conversation. For some organizations, it is surprising the number of questions that they have about whether or not we can use personal devices to store, process, or transmit corporate information. Or can we use WeChat? Or can we use Huawei? Or can we use a specific technology? The answer to the question should start at the organization level because the senior executive leadership has identified their risk tolerance. For some organizations, Huawei is just a technology manufacturer. Whatever risk people perceive is not going to be significant for one company, where for another company, it could be of significant concern because of the type of data that they have and because of the risk that exposure of that data could produce. So answering this question at the executive level creates the best opportunity for success because now the senior leadership has defined the requirements and the boundaries and the approach and the resources that are going to be applied to achieve the outcome that they want to realize. One of the other benefits about defining your risk management at the executive level is that the overall governance structure established by the organization is pushed down to every other part of the company. When you start pushing things down into other parts of the company, that's when you get to level 2 inside this tiered organizational hierarchy. Level 2 focuses on mission and business processes and starts to describe different departments that you have within the organization. And so your chief financial officer would be the head of the mission and business process focused on financial management. Your chief operating officer would be in charge of the mission or business process related to IT operations, if it's a technology company, or related to plant operations if we're talking about a manufacturing company. Understanding who the leaders are of those different business processes now allows you to start assigning responsibilities and accountabilities for aligning the practices of that department to what was established at the governance level at level one. Now, if the business at the executive level said, we're not going to accept risk that produces more than $1 million of losses, each individual department now has to make sure that they have put practices and controls in place to prevent a loss of more than $1 million. We have distributed the responsibility for risk management throughout the organization. And now, instead of holding the CISO accountable for all of the risk decisions and all of the risk outcomes, the board of directors or the executive level is going to hold the department leaders accountable for what results, what happens, and how well they have managed the risk management program. This now repositions the cyber executive so that the cyber executive is an advocate for all levels of the business and is the person that everybody comes to verify that we have satisfied the requirements, that we're operating within the boundaries, and that we're producing the results that we're looking for. Now, each individual department leader can define the types of information that they need for their business unit. They can do the data classification based on what the department's requirements are. They can develop an enterprise information protection strategy and advocate for the budget. And now, because it's not the CISO requesting budget for security controls, but it is the individual departments advocating for and providing the budget for the controls, you have a much more robust and mature ecosystem for protecting all of the interests and the assets of the organization. Ultimately, this pushes you down to level 3, which defines the requirements for your individual information systems. It is at level 3 that ISO in your information security management system, or the NIST cybersecurity framework, or the Center for Internet Security critical security controls start. The benefit that you have of this approach is that you're not starting at the information system level, you're starting at the organization level, and the organization is going to push requirements down to each individual information technology system, to each application, and you have a robust governance framework that covers everything that's happening, everywhere that it's happening for the company, whether we're talking about data that's on premises, in the cloud, on an application, or we have data exchange between third parties. We've now made everybody responsible for security and risk management. Now, with that said, once you understand the governance structure, that does not remove the responsibilities that the cyber executive has in the equation. The shift that's produced by adopting the approach that's in NIST 800-39 is that it allows the cyber executive to focus on specific objectives, specific initiatives, and specific outcomes because the entire organization is sharing risk management. Now, inside of my security and risk management programs, I can focus on things that are specifically aligned to business objectives. If we start with the business objectives, our business objectives that everybody understands because they're part of the process are going to define programs that I develop as the cyber executive. And then my programs are going to have specific activities that are performed that satisfy the business objective. And so the table helps decompose what I'm talking about verbally. In the table, if you start at the first row, you see that the business objective is that we want to provide containment, eradication, and recovery for identified incidents. Now, obviously, that describes security operations and the role that incident response plays within the organization. The business is not necessarily going to describe the objective that specifically, but in their description of incident response and reducing the impact of incidents, we're really describing a program area for security operations. If everybody in the business is invested in the value that is produced by accomplishing this business objective, you are much more likely to have the budget and the resources that you need for people, processes, and technology to support event management, event monitoring, network monitoring, incident response. digital forensic investigation, root cause analysis, everything that is involved in security operations, you are much more likely to have support because the entire business is invested in the process. If the entire business using the tiered organizational hierarchy is invested in the process, then when you get to line 2, you can have a business objective described as assessing and maintaining risk at an acceptable level. Recall when I talked about level 1 at the senior executive level of the organization, it's the organization's responsibility to define the acceptable level of risk. If the organization has defined risk rather than the cyber executive defining risk, the organization is going to be much more invested in the risk management program, and the organization is going to provide the resources that you need for risk management, risk treatment, risk monitoring, risk assessment, and everything else that happens in a risk program. Similarly, for compliance management, because the organization is involved in the process, the organization is going to describe satisfying regulatory requirements for security and privacy as a business objective. Again, the General Data Protection Regulation is a good example of this, where GDPR has driven companies to invest significantly in protecting personal information for citizens of the European Union or the European Economic Area. Everybody in the business understands the requirement. Everybody in the business understands the impact of failing to meet that requirement. So the business is going to invest in a compliance management program that the cyber executive is going to lead. And then you're going to get people, processes, and technology for policy enforcement, for privacy engineering, for compliance, and for all of your controls to satisfy the requirements. Now, the table that I have on the slide could be expanded, where you have the business objective is the first column, and then the security program is the second column. In the third column, we describe activities. In the fourth column, you might identify roles and responsibilities to support each individual program. You could add an additional column that describes the people that are required. You could add a column for process. You could add a column for technology. You could add a column for budget. This is just a structured approach for describing what is the business objective, and then what are all of the activities that are going to be performed to satisfy the business objective inside of your security programs. If your organization is more mature and you have an information security management system, your ISMS should help you accomplish a lot of this. What I've seen in practice is that organizations who have ISO 27000 certification still don't have the granular description of every program, all of the activities that are performed, and then the specific identification of people, process, technology, and budget that ensures that you achieve your goals for access control, for incident response, for configuration management, for risk management, for security operations, and for everything else that is going to support your business. And so as we are about halfway through, what we're really talking about, if you sit back and consider everything that I've said, we're really having a risk management conversation. Your modern cybersecurity program is going to help the organization identify, understand, document, and respond to the security risk that the organization is facing. And that security risk is going to be considered in conjunction or in combination with all of the other risks that the business is concerned with, like regulatory risk, financial risk, operational risk, or reputational risk. Fortunately for cyber executive leaders, we already have numerous frameworks that describe a risk management approach. The workflow that's on the slide is the same workflow whether I'm using NIST, whether I'm using ISO, whether I'm using COBIT. And even when we start going into financial risk management or operational risk management, the process is the same across all risk areas and across all risk practices. The idea is that we're going to start with establishing context so that we know what the risk management program is applying to. Are we doing it on an individual information system? Are we doing it for all of the information systems within a department? Are we doing it in a country office because we are a global organization and we have offices in different countries? Are we doing it for the entire enterprise? Once we establish the context, then I can start with my risk assessment process to go through a structured approach to identify all of the risks that the company is exposed to. Once I understand the risk, we can then think about risk treatment. Once the risk is treated, we can do monitoring to make sure that we're maintaining risk at an acceptable level. And throughout the life cycle of our risk management program, we're going to report to stakeholders, the business, the mission and business process function, and the organization. What is our progress? How are we doing? And are we satisfying the requirements? In practice, most security executives spend the majority of their time on risk treatment because they're using the control catalog and applying the controls to individual information systems. In reality, all 5 of these objectives that are listed in this workflow are going to be important because they describe a comprehensive program. Items that we'll talk about in just a moment, like factor analysis of information risk, the threat agent risk assessment from Intel, or the threat assessment and remediation analysis from the MITRE organization, enhance the approach that you're going to use in the risk assessment process so that you have a complete understanding of the risk that you're facing. And all of this is going to enhance and improve risk treatment, risk monitoring, and risk reporting. Before we get there, again, it's important to make sure that you understand the context of what you're dealing with. Depending upon how your organization is structured, you may have a distributed organization with distributed management, or you might have consolidated management where everything reports to a single unit or a division or department within the organization. But that context is going to be important because it is going to influence how do I identify the stakeholders, who are my partners, who's going to provide information that I need to accomplish my goals, and how are we going to ensure that the stakeholders are satisfied because we have achieved the risk management objectives, we have reduced risk to an acceptable level, and the organization is protected. With the context in place, there are 2 primary approaches that you can use to assess your risk, especially when we're talking about the cyber executive leader assessing and evaluating what would normally be considered cybersecurity risk. Globally, the most popular approach for risk assessment and analysis for cybersecurity is found in ISO 27005. 27005 is intentionally designed as a security risk management approach and has a good collection of features, functionality, guidance, and recommendation that is going to help you not only do risk assessment, but is going to help you establish context, assess risk. It guides the treatment of risk. It allows you to have 2 feedback loops that support monitoring and communication, and provides a comprehensive program. My focus in this conversation at this point is just to look at the risk analysis process or the risk assessment process. And within risk assessment, ISO 27005 has 3 phases. You do risk identification, where you're going to identify your assets, your threats, your controls, your vulnerabilities, and your consequences. When you just think about those bullets, it brings us back to what we talked about related to governance. If we have a good governance framework, governance is going to help us make sure that we have documented all of the assets within the organization. When we had the conversation originally, I said that asset management is one of the corporate governance responsibilities because the business has to tell you what the assets are, where they exist, and how important they are. And so if I have completed that asset management step in advance of doing my risk assessment, it makes the process much easier and it increases the confidence that we have in the results that are produced. Now, the threat assessment is wholly the responsibility of the cyber executive. Once I have good documentation for all of my assets, I can start to think about the threat vectors, the threat actors, the capabilities of those threat actors, and how they work in conjunction with the controls that we have in place. And the combination of threat plus the control effectiveness is going to describe the level of vulnerability that we're facing. After I have finished my risk identification, now we can start to do risk analysis, where we're going to look at the consequences of a successful attack, and the likelihood of success relates to the effectiveness of the controls that we have in place. This produces a level of risk determination chart that's described in ISO 27005. And using that chart, when we go to risk evaluation, numerically, I can list all of the risks that has been identified in priority order. So whatever has the highest number is going to be the highest priority, and we rank everything from highest to lowest. This slide provides an example of the level of risk determination. What you would normally do is fill in the details so that you understand for every asset, what is the collection of risks that we're facing, and how do we measure those risks in numerical terms. This is an example of quantitative risk analysis using the framework that is provided by ISO 27005. But the result ultimately is that because I have a numeric value, I can now rank all of the risks that I'm assessing from the highest impact to the lowest impact, which is going to influence the application of our limited resources to address the risks that we identified. Theoretically, everything that has an 8 as the result of the risk assessment is going to be the highest priority. And then in order until we have exhausted all of our resources, we're going to address all of the 8s, then we'll address the 7s, then we'll address the 6s, and keep going until our resources are exhausted. Following this approach, it creates the opportunity to ensure that we have applied limited resources to the highest impact items rather than focusing first on items of little significance or little consequence, and then we have no money left to address the items that are going to be meaningful or impactful for the organization. Your alternative to using the ISO approach is found in NIST Special Publication 800-30. Regardless of the approach that you use, the results that you produce are going to be similar. The benefit of the NIST 800-30 approach is that NIST in this risk assessment guide aligns and works well with the cybersecurity framework from NIST that a lot of people are adopting and using to describe the cybersecurity controls that they have in place. During Cyber Week, when we had the presentations yesterday, there was a description of the cybersecurity framework that talked about the categories of identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover. And the effectiveness of those cybersecurity controls can be measured using the NIST 800-30 approach for risk assessment. What you find in the NIST approach is that the concept of a frame is similar to the concept of context establishment that you have in the ISO approach. Once you have established your frame and I understand what we're dealing with, NIST uses assessment, response, and monitoring in conjunction so that all three activities are happening simultaneously as an ongoing activity that is influenced by the risk frame. When you're doing your risk framing, the frame is described by the diagram that's listed here, and there is a full description inside the document if you decide to download it. Again, fortunately, this document is free and it doesn't cost any money to obtain. Inside the risk frame, what you will see is that starting at the top, you're going to look at your assumptions, your constraints, your priorities and your trade-offs, the risk tolerance that was established at the organization level, the uncertainty that you're facing, and all of that is going to start to produce a frame. The risk frame is going to determine your assessment methodology. And once you have determined your assessment methodology, then you're going to follow a process. You're going to use a risk model. You're going to use an assessment approach, and then you're going to do analysis. The items that are inside the white box are then described in more detail in this diagram, where the threat source and its consequences are going to initiate with the likelihood a threat event. Your threat event is going to be described by a sequence of actions. The actions are going to be evaluated based on the likelihood of whether or not they're going to exploit a vulnerability. Your vulnerability is described by the severity in the context of conditions that exist, What's the level of control that we have? Are the controls implemented in place and effective? Is there some other consideration? Predisposing conditions describe the entire control environment and how well you can withstand or react or prevent the execution of a vulnerability. Then the residual risk that remains describes the vulnerability, and now you can assess the adverse impact that is caused by the vulnerability, which produces the organizational risk that you're facing. Verbally, it sounds like a significant level of effort to document, but if you can establish a consistent framework based on the level of risk tolerance described at the organization level, now you have the opportunity to say how much risk are we willing to accept and how much do we have to invest in people, processes, and technology to achieve and maintain risk at an acceptable level. If you choose not to use NIST and you choose not to use ISO, your assessment can be enhanced by other opportunities or by other frameworks. And so, a framework that is often accepted by the business is the factor analysis of information risk. The short version of the acronym is just described as FAIR, and FAIR enhances risk analysis by helping organizations determine the nature and impact of their risk, and it does this in financial terms. The financial terms is one of the benefits of this approach because everybody in the business, even those people who are non-technical business leaders, understand the financial results of some risk that is not mitigated and is not managed at an acceptable level. And so using the FAIR approach, stakeholders are provided with a standard and best practices that help us to measure, manage, and report on risk from a business perspective. The way that you produce this is using what FAIR calls an ontology. The benefit of the ontology is that it describes everything in a common vocabulary using a common language that everybody understands. If you've taken the CISSP exam or Security Plus or any other security test, what people most often refer to is annualized loss expectancy, ALE, is going to be the approach that you use to measure risk, where you're combining the single loss event times the annual rate of occurrence to estimate what is the total impact if there was some kind of incident on an asset. What you can see in the FAIR risk ontology is that you have a much more robust approach for describing risk, and it leads you to having better information when you're communicating to the business about the magnitude and the harm that you can expect to realize. It is the combination of two perspectives where I'm looking at the loss event frequency combined with the loss magnitude. Loss event frequency is relatively straightforward. Our vulnerability is described by the capability of the threat actor and the effectiveness of our controls to make their attack increasingly difficult. Then the threat event frequency is just how often do we expect or anticipate that we're going to encounter the threat actor and what is the probability of their action. And so the threat event frequency combined with the vulnerability describes more comprehensively the loss event frequency that we can expect for an attack against an asset from a specific threat actor. And what you would normally do is calculate this result for all threat actors that we've considered so that the aggregate result, combining everything together, tells you the total loss event frequency that you're facing. On the other side of the diagram, you also want to calculate loss magnitude. And the benefit of loss magnitude using the FAIR approach is that you're going to think about primary losses and secondary losses. A primary loss is the initial impact that is produced by a successful attack from the threat actor. And so if somebody does SQL injection, they gain access to the environment, they do data exfiltration of personal information, there is going to be an initial impact and primary loss that is the result of a successful SQL injection attack. We can estimate the cost of that. We can understand the financial, the reputational, the operational, and the regulatory impact of SQL injection, of ransomware, or of any other type of malicious action that's taken that would be described as an event, an incident, or a data breach. The benefit of FAIR is that not only do you consider your primary losses, but you also consider your secondary losses. A secondary loss is described as the outcome that is produced when a third party takes some action related to the primary loss. The General Data Protection Regulation is a good example. If there was a data breach that caused unauthorized access or exposure for citizens from the European Union or the European Economic Area, there is going to be an initial cost. We had an outage, operations were affected, we had downtime, we lost money. But then Brussels is going to come along, and from the regulators in Brussels, there is going to be a fine of either 2% or 4% of our global revenue that would be calculated as the secondary risk, and that secondary risk has a loss associated with it. So our entire loss magnitude is going to be the combination of the initial impact plus the secondary impact, so that we have a comprehensive understanding of the total loss that we're going to realize from a specific type of cyber attack facilitated by a specific threat actor using whatever capability that they have to overcome the controls that we have in place. It is a long conversation, but it is a very comprehensive and robust approach that gives credibility to the findings that you're presenting to the business or to the board of directors, and helps represent all of that data in financial terms so that the organization understands what is the total financial loss that we're going to realize, either from individual findings or from the combination of all of the findings together in aggregate. As you look more deeply at the FAIR cyber risk framework, one of the things that is valuable in the approach is that it helps reconcile the relationship between 4 independent landscapes that are then used to specifically define what FAIR is describing as risk. The asset landscape represents all of the information concerning everything that you need to protect. And so we have continued to talk about assets, and we have continued to represent that assets are anything that has value to the organization. It could be information, it could be systems, it could be ICT, it could be physical assets that support the physical world if you're doing manufacturing or industrial control systems. But whatever you define as an asset is going to be the focus of the asset landscape. The threat landscape consists of the information that we need to understand the threat actors who are going to try to leverage a vulnerability to attack our asset. The controls landscape represents the collection of existing and planned controls that are going to affect our risk analysis. The controls that we put in place are going to work against the threat actors to reduce the amount of vulnerability that we have, which ultimately reduces our susceptibility to a successful attack. The loss landscape is the result of what I showed you on the previous slide and the outcome of the FAIR calculation, where the loss landscape represents the consequence that losses of confidentiality, integrity, and availability might have on assets, and those losses are represented in financial terms. What you see in the gray cloud around those 4 different relationships or landscapes is the entire description of the vulnerability landscape that is the combination of your threats, your controls, and your assets, which helps you understand how susceptible are you to a successful attack. When you apply the FAIR process, now that you have greater understanding and greater knowledge about the outcome that we're trying to produce, step 1, you are going to start with identification of your assets and identification of your threats. Then you're going to estimate your loss event frequency. Then you're going to evaluate the probable loss magnitude. The outcome of all of this and the results from your FAIR risk analysis is that you can provide context for risk treatment so that the business responds properly because they understand the total risk that they're facing in financial terms. And so when you get to step 4 and you are deriving and articulating risk, it is based on all of the work that you've done in the previous steps and produces a financial result. Now, for some organizations, the asset landscape and the threat landscape and the vulnerability landscape is just too big to conceive of or to manage properly. And so you can distill your risk even further with the threat agent risk assessment from Intel. Intel is a good example of an enhancement to our risk management process because Intel is a very large organization. They do manufacturing, they do sales, they have lots of regulatory requirements because of the way that their products are used in numerous industries and for numerous use cases. And so the idea with the threat agent risk assessment is that it helps risk leaders develop strategies by distilling everything that could happen into a digest of what is most likely to occur. The visual model for this is on the right side of the slide. In discussion, the Terra methodology identifies which threats pose the greatest risk to the organization. It helps the risk leaders understand what the threat actors want to accomplish and the likely methods that will be used. The methods are then cross-referenced with existing vulnerabilities and the controls that you have in place to determine which areas are most exposed, and then your security strategy focuses on your most exposed areas to minimize your effort while maximizing the effect. Now, the awareness of the most exposed areas allows the company to make better decisions about how to manage risk, which helps balance spending, prevent impacts, and manage risk at an acceptable level of residual risk. When we talk about residual risk is the amount of risk that remains after you have put your controls in place. There's always going to be some level of risk that continues to remain, and there's always going to be some threat actor that finds a way to leverage an attack against the residual risk. And so narrowing everything down to the most likely exposures allows you to focus your limited people, your limited process, your limited technology, and your limited budget on the most important areas or concerns for the organization. When you do this properly, the threat agent risk assessment is going to involve 6 specific steps that you're going to perform to produce the result that is the collection of bubbles on the bottom right of the graphic. So we're going to measure our current threat agent risk to the organization. Number 1 is achieved with our threat intelligence feeds, with the information that's provided by our vendors, with our metrics, with our monitoring, with our security operations program. Every bit of information that we can obtain is going to provide input so that we can measure the threat agent risk to the organization. Our threat intelligence is also going to help us distinguish threat agents that exceed the baseline of acceptable risk, because if we know the difference between a passive attacker and a motivated attacker, it helps us separate the two and focus on the motivated attacker and the capabilities that they have. The objectives of those threat agents is going to add additional context. Then I can think about the methods that they're most likely going to use. A very good tool for number 4 is to use something like the MITRE attack framework and then measure all of the information in the attack framework against the controls environment that I have within my organization. The result of 1 through 4 is going to help me to determine the most important collective exposures. And then the result of the collective exposures is going to allow me to identify a strategy that is going to solve the greatest number of problems possible with the resources that I have available. Now, the threat agent risk assessment is a very business-centric approach, and it is going to require good information in advance. So every mention of threat intelligence or analysis or information that I described is going to influence how well you can produce the results. The alternative to using the Intel approach is to use a similar approach from MITRE that is more technical and system engineering focused. If I use the MITRE framework, I'm going to conduct a threat assessment and remediation analysis using a document that predates the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I can't remember the date for threat assessment and remediation analysis, but if you do a Google search for the heading that's on the slide, it will take you to a document from MITRE, and it describes a framework whereby on similar paths or simultaneously, you're going to do cyber threat susceptibility analysis, which evaluates your susceptibility to an attack from a motivated threat actor. In conjunction with that, you're going to do cyber risk remediation analysis that focuses on the installation, the maturity, and the effectiveness of your controls to serve as countermeasures to prevent the threat actor from being successful. In conjunction with all of this, you are going to consider the data and the tools that need to be developed so that you can enhance your protections and reduce the likelihood of a successful attack from a motivated attacker. Throughout the conversation, I have described how important definitions are. And so if you choose to look at threat assessment and remediation analysis, it's important to understand that from MITRE's perspective, a cyber asset is any IT asset used to store, transport, or process information, and this is going to bring into consideration servers, client systems, network appliances, and data that is important to the organization. With that context, you now can start to think about your crown jewels, where they are, the path from the outside of the enterprise to where the crown jewels are housed inside the enterprise, and the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place to prevent a motivated attacker from gaining access to your crown jewels. Now, whether you're using FAIR or you're using the threat agent risk assessment from Intel or threat assessment and remediation analysis from MITRE, all of these tools are meant to help you understand and identify the risks that your organization is facing. Once that step is accomplished, you can now plan your treatment. As I said early in the conversation, risk treatment is going to be a business decision. The cyber executive contributes to that decision by providing good information, by doing good analysis, by having good quality data to support whatever your claims are. But the CISO does not control the budget, the perspective, the outcomes, or the decision of the business. You are limited to providing information and then trusting that the business is going to make the best decision. When the business is making the decision about the treatment options, there are always 4 options that exist. The boxes that are listed here have different words because different frameworks are going to use a different term to describe the outcome that we want to produce, but we generally mean the same thing in each box. And so if we start with retention or acceptance, the idea is that we have done a risk assessment, we've conducted analysis, we understand the risk that we're facing, and the business chooses to accept that risk and to continue operating without doing anything. The next option is sharing or transfer, where the business is going to buy cyber insurance or enter into an agreement with a third party that allows them to distribute the risk and reduces the total impact that the organization is facing. Some organizations are going to choose to avoid or eliminate their risk because they choose not to do the business process. Ideally, you want to do risk assessment before you make decisions. And if I've done an assessment in advance and determined that the place that I'm going to build a data center is subject to natural disasters, I can avoid the risk of a natural disaster by not building a data center where they have a lot of tsunamis or where they have a lot of earthquakes or something else that I want to avoid. Similarly, some organizations have decided to avoid or eliminate the risk of a compromise in the cloud by not adapting cloud services and maintaining everything in a traditional data center. Whatever the context is, the idea with avoidance is that you are choosing not to perform the desired business activity so that the risk associated with that activity does not impact your organization. The most common risk treatment option in the top left is modification or mitigation. The idea is that you're going to conduct an assessment. I understand the risk that we're facing, and then I'm going to apply some kind of control or transformation in the environment that is going to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. And so, if there is a risk of unauthorized access or disclosure of information, I'm going to use encryption to reduce that risk because you have to have the encryption key to unencrypt the data so that you can see what it is. Or I'm going to use multi-factor authentication so that I have more confidence that only authorized users are gaining access to the information. The reason that modification or mitigation is the most common treatment option is that most of your treatment is described in control catalogs, and organizations are comfortable and familiar with adopting control catalogs to provide that treatment and to put the controls in place. With that said, because business because risk treatment is a business decision, it's important that you understand the feelings and the motivations that drive the response from your business stakeholders and from your counterparts. All of this for the next few slides just falls into the area of emotional psychology, which has a significant influence on the relationship between security and the business. For most security people, you have likely encountered concepts of tolerance, appetite, or aversion, which all describe the feelings that influence risk treatment. In most contexts, tolerance and appetite are treated as the same or synonyms, and they produce a similar result, where aversion is the opposite of the two. If you define risk tolerance academically, risk tolerance defines the level of risk an organization is willing to assume based on organizational perceptions of risk. So all of the things that we do in the tiered organizational hierarchy are going to help the organization to formally define a level of risk tolerance because we have a similar or complete perception about the risk the organization is facing. Risk appetite is similar, but has a slightly different definition and is focused on the amount of risk that an organization is willing to accept in pursuit of its long-term objectives. This definition of risk appetite goes back to the National Association of Corporate Directors statistic that I cited, where we said that 61% of business executives are willing to ignore security requirements to obtain business goals. This is a good representation of risk appetite because they're willing to accept security risk in exchange for achieving their business objectives. Most often, the business is going to have a high level of tolerance, or the business is going to have a high level of appetite, and the cyber executive is going to be in the opposite bucket and have a high level of risk aversion, where risk aversion is defined as the behavior that people demonstrate when exposed to uncertainty and whether or not or what they will do to reduce the uncertainty that they're facing. And so if I'm uncertain about the motivations of a threat actor and the capabilities that they have, because I have high aversion, I'm going to do everything that I can to put controls in place to reduce that risk and to generate more confidence in the capability of the environment to stop the attacker from being successful. And so security people generally have high aversion. Business people generally have high tolerance and high appetite. And following an enterprise risk management framework brings everybody together so that we can come to an agreement about what is the best approach for our specific business or organization. Now, when you're trying to bring everything together, it is important to consider how irrational people behave. Now, irrational is not saying that the people are crazy or that they don't have the right motivations, but it is important to remember that human behavior drives people to act in their own self-interest. And when people are in doubt and they don't understand cybersecurity risk because cyber executives haven't explained it properly or they haven't put it in the business context, people in doubt are going to act according to their current irrational urges. They're going to ignore information that runs counter to their beliefs, and they're going to focus on short-term benefits that apply to them directly rather than thinking about the long-term benefits for the entire group. In this context, the group represents the entire company. And so, two mistakes that security executives or cyber executives need to consider are: number one, do not assume the people that you're serving are well informed, rational, independent choice makers. Your business, non technical counterparts are making decisions based on how they understand the information that's provided and how they relate to the information that they're receiving from security. The second mistake to avoid is to assume that everyone is like you, they know what you know, and they want what you want. Very often, business executives receive their compensation based on incentives. And so if performing a business activity and achieving success is going to generate a bonus, I am much more focused on the bonus that I'm going to get and what it takes to produce that than I am on managing the risk that might cause harm to the entire organization. This idea leads into an additional psychological concern that you want to be familiar with, known as optimism bias, that causes people to believe that they are less at risk of experiencing a negative event compared to others. And so if you look at the behavior of organizations, or if you look at the behavior of individuals, even when everybody in your industry or everybody in your group is recognizing or realizing some kind of negative harm or negative consequence, optimism bias leads people to say, you know what, that happened to my neighbor, but it's not going to happen to me. They have a very positive outlook on life, and they're willing to accept more risk because they don't believe that they are going to suffer the same consequences that have happened to something else, that have happened to somebody else. Similarly, the rational choice principle drives individual behavior because rational choice states that given the choices available, individual people will make decisions that provide the greatest individual benefit or satisfaction. They're focusing on their own self-interest rather than focusing on the benefits of the company or the organization. And then confirmation bias interprets people to search for or interpret information in a way that confirms what they already believed. It often leads to statistical errors and has a huge influence on risk decisions. And so if you combine this perfect storm of psychology, we have optimism bias, which says that nothing bad is going to happen to me. And then I have confirmation bias, where I only accept information that reinforces my opinion. And then I am driven by my own individual self-interest with the rational choice principle. It is no wonder that with a lack of good governance or without good boundaries within the organization, business leaders are going to choose to focus on the business result that benefits them personally rather than focusing on what is going to benefit the entire organization. The solution to this problem is really just good corporate culture. If we have good culture, if we have good governance, if everybody understands their role and responsibility for security, and every individual, especially the business leaders, are held accountable for their decisions, we are now on the right track for success. Now, what's not included as a deep exploration in this conversation are the other facets of risk management. Risk monitoring should be an ongoing process. Once you have done your assessment, you've put your controls in place to reduce risk to an acceptable level. You cannot walk away and assume that the controls are going to remain effective and in place. It requires ongoing analysis and continuous monitoring so that as the environment changes, as you update technology, as you patch systems, as you change your infrastructure and go from a traditional data center to the cloud, you must continuously monitor the environment to ensure that your controls continue to produce the level of risk reduction that you were looking for. Similarly, we could have a long conversation about risk reporting and effective communication. However, at a high level, it is important to discuss and highlight that it is imperative that cyber executive leaders continue to communicate to their stakeholders, what are you doing, how are you doing it, and what is the impact? Now, part of that is going to be addressed in our metrics conversation. Part of that is just the outcome of good business leadership because you're communicating with your stakeholders and your chain of command, but it is the ongoing outcome of good risk management that you're going to regularly report and provide good communication to the business. And so in summary, as we wrap up and prepare to take a break and we can open the session for questions, the framework that we discussed was everything involved in risk management and how you can focus not only on the technical skills, but the business, the executive, the leadership requirements that are necessary for you to be successful when you're talking about risk management programs with business leaders who don't have the same knowledge that you have about all the technical controls that are in place. Don't forget to establish context so that you know what the risk management program is applying to. Use good tools and practices to conduct your risk assessment, to analyze the risk, and to communicate the risk in terms that are meaningful to the organization. Make sure that you're using good catalogs and standards to drive your risk treatment. Make sure that the business understands why the treatment is valuable so that emotional and organizational psychology don't drive them to make bad decisions. Once the risk treatment has been implemented, make sure that you monitor the effectiveness of the program so that if something changes, you also update your treatment so that you maintain risk at an acceptable level, and then continue to communicate nonstop so everybody understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, and the results that are produced. If you're interested, you guys will have a copy of the slides. So this is really more for the slides. We do this as longer, more detailed scenarios and conversations. This was a condensed version of a much longer conversation for Moldova Cyber Week. And if you have additional questions that we don't have time to answer, I'm happy to engage with you in conversation on LinkedIn, or you can send me an email directly, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. At this time, I will turn it over to our Master of Ceremony to facilitate the question and answer portion before we take a break for coffee. Are there any questions? If you don't want to come off mute and say it verbally, you can type the questions in the chat as well. All right, so I'm getting a couple of thank yous as private messages in the chat. We will assume that there are no questions remaining from this session. The next session after this break starts at 15:45. When you return, if you choose to return, and I hope you do, our conversation will be about cybersecurity metrics. How do you avoid senseless security metrics? And how do you represent the information clearly when you're communicating to the business? Thank you all for your time, for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you after the break.
Keyaan, welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that so many people stayed and did not run away screaming.
No, they can't.
we ready to begin, or do we want to wait a few minutes?
I don't think so. I think we begin, and then I will publish the video record on the webpage.
Okay, excellent.
So if someone is away, they will watch the link later on.
Sounds good. So we'll go ahead and begin.
Good. Thank you.
So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for returning, or thank you for staying, or thank you for watching the recording, depending on how you engage with the content. In the first session, or in the first half of this training, I provided an overview of building a security program. One of the items that we talked about in the overview was the role that security metrics play to help you communicate. And where we did not have enough time to provide the overview of communication in the previous session, this session is focused exclusively on communication using good, well-documented security metrics. If you did not join the first session and you are joining us just now, very briefly, my name is Keyaan Williams. I am presenting this to you from Atlanta, Georgia, in the United States. I have been a security leader, business leader for over 15 years, but I've been doing cybersecurity and technology for 25. And everything that I'm sharing with you is based on my experience, not so much based on something that I read in a book that I've never done before. When we go into the conversation about metrics, it's important for everybody to understand what is a metric, how it works, and what value is produced from that information. Instead of only sharing with you the things that I see, the things that I think, the things that I know, I invited a few of my friends and colleagues and other prominent people in the industry to share their ideas as well. Now, Marcus Random, I cannot call him a friend, but we are acquainted and I respect him very much. Once upon a time, he was the chief security officer at Tenable Network Security, and he has been in security even longer than I have. And I have been doing this for quite a while. But back in 2015, Marcus Random and some others were doing a regional conference where in multiple cities around the United States, they would give presentations. And one of the compelling presentations that they provided focused on metrics. According to Marcus, a metric is some data and an algorithm for reducing it to tell a story. The significance of the metrics comes from context, and the context is specific information about relevant processes. So that is a direct quote. In conjunction with the presentation from Marcus, he also had some help from Alex Hunt, who was the co-author of the presentation. And they both gave me permission to use that quote inside the Certified Chief Information Security Officer body of knowledge that I wrote, I think it was back in 2017, 2018. But the point is that since that conversation with them, since they allowed me to use the content in the book, I have continued to explore what are all of the best ways in the world to document security metrics and to communicate them to the business so that the metrics make a difference in communicating the value of security to the organization. Most of what security does is hard to describe, it's hard to quantify, it is hard to represent to people who do not do the same work that we do professionally. And it becomes even more important that security leaders or anybody who contributes to a security program understands what type of data needs to be captured and what type of data needs to be communicated so that the business can make good decisions. For this session specifically, over the next hour, our focus is going to be to solve two problems. One, everywhere I go, especially when I'm giving a live presentation and we have time for questions and answers, or people come to me privately after the presentation, there is often a question that focuses on how do you develop metrics? What are the right metrics for me? How do I create metrics that are going to communicate value to my organization? And then for other people, the question really isn't about how do I create the metrics? The question is more about how do I take all of the information that I have and format the information in a way that the business understands what they need to know and they respond to that information properly. Now, I hope to solve that problem while we have this conversation. I've been doing this for a long time, and I don't consider the metrics problem to be that much of a problem anymore. What I would argue is that practice makes people proficient, and I've just had the benefit of practicing with metrics for quite a while. Going back to my time at the Centers for Disease Control, another set of practices that are very valuable is learning how to do statistical analysis, because statisticians are very good at taking large data sets, boiling that information down, reducing it into a format that tells a good story that represents the information that people need to understand. And so when you think about representing data, that's really what we're doing for this presentation and for this conversation. And the conversation starts with the idea of language. If you missed the presentation yesterday, or if you missed the first session today, one of the things that I continue to focus on is the language of cybersecurity is very important. And when you're documenting your metrics, as you'll see later in the session, it's critical that people understand what you mean when you say something. One of the items that we want to focus on again is just the definition of cybersecurity. You can read the slide. It's not much different from what we talked about before. But again, we want to make sure that when we're communicating our security metrics, the business and our non-technical counterparts understand that we're talking about that we're protecting computer systems and networks from theft or damage because of some kind of attack, compromise, or other situation. Now, that's the only definition in this section. Another thing to think about is just the idea of measurement. Back in the 1990s, early into the 2000s, there was a scientific show that was created for younger children that helped them explore the world of science in simple terms. Realistically, we're helping business people explore the world of cybersecurity in terms that they can understand, but the way that Bill Nye, the science guy, describes measurement is very close to what we want to accomplish for security measurements and the way that we use those measurements to represent risk and drive some kind of decision. In the physical world, the things we measure most are length, mass, time, and temperature, and these measurements help people understand the world around them. Using a standard of measurement allows everybody in the conversation to understand what is being measured in the context of the results. So a meter in the United States is the same length when you measure a meter in Russia, in Bulgaria, in France, in Nigeria, in Australia. A pound is a pound, an hour is an hour, a Kelvin is a Kelvin, a kilometer is a kilometer. Having a standard form of measurement is very valuable. This is the reason that I used the factor analysis of information risk in the previous presentation, because representing risk in financial terms gives you a standard unit of measurement that everybody in the organization can understand. And because everybody understands it, we can all come to the same conclusions about the risk that we're exposed to and make the same decisions about how we're going to manage that risk. The measurement that we use in security is going to make a big difference because it influences behavior. You imagine if we were having just a regular conversation and I decided to walk a distance and that distance requires a car. I know that I need a car because of the distance. You know, if I'm walking 50 meters, I can walk. If it's 500 meters, it makes sense to have a car. In the same context, if the risk that we're exposed to is going to be $5, maybe we don't do anything about it and we accept the risk. If it's going to be $5 million, it makes sense to start to consider controls, countermeasures, and other mitigations to help avoid and reduce the likelihood of a $5 million loss. All of this leads into the idea that security metrics should provide information that supports and justifies business decisions. The struggle with metrics affects all business leaders who strive to measure and communicate the value of their programs and initiatives. So metrics is not exclusive to security. Security people aren't the only people who struggle with metrics. The thing that security people face is that we are the rare part of the organization that has our own language, that has our own vocabulary, and the vocabulary needs to be transformed into business terms so that the business understands what is the actual risk that they're exposed to so that they can make a real decision about what to do next. So ultimately, my goal is to shine a light onto old security measurements so that you have a better understanding about how to represent them in the context of the business that you support. Now, I don't know Bill Nye, and I do know Marcus, and I do know Joy, but Joy is a very good board executive who also provided some context to help with the presentation. And according to Joy, she said that few boards have cyber risk and risk savvy non-executive board members. So even less can apply those skills with a clear understanding of the business. And so Joy is not a security person, she is a business person. She's the chairman of the board. She served on several public and private companies, but she recognizes and understands as the chairman that most of the people on her board of directors or the boards that she's been involved with really don't understand what security is communicating when they come to the meeting. They provide results and they try to describe the risk that the organization is exposed to. Hearing this from a business person and understanding that that context is missing is the beginning of what you need to do to combine the knowledge that you have with the context that's going to be valuable so that the business can make good decisions. I keep talking about the business making good decisions, but it just reinforces the idea that risk management is a business decision. The only way they can make good decisions is if we provide good risk information that is going to influence what they choose to do. Now, good metrics are the key to unlocking communication between security and the business. Generally, we have confusion when people use different measurements. For example, I know the United States uses Fahrenheit, and it has taken me a while to convert Celsius into Fahrenheit. So I know what the temperature is when people are talking because the scales of measurement are completely different. And so if I speak in Celsius, or if you speak in Celsius and I speak in Fahrenheit, and we're not speaking the same language, then we have different expectations about the right tool, where in this context, the tool is, do I wear a jacket? Do I wear a sweater? Do I wear shorts because it's hot or cold? I need to understand the environment. That same idea about the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius is basically the idea that Joy was communicating. It applies to money, where a dollar is worth a dollar in the US, but a dollar is worth a different value if you compared it to a British pound or a Singapore dollar or a South African rand or any other currency. And every time I'm talking to somebody in a different time zone, we have to agree about the time. I appreciate that we established that we're talking in Eastern European time because 1500 US is a completely different time than we're dealing with. Again, all of these examples represent that if we're not communicating in a format that people expect, that they understand, and that they're looking for, there's going to be confusion, and the understanding has to be established and has to exist at the business because the business is making decisions about how we're going to address the risk that we're facing. And so if we skip from the introduction and start looking at the focus of the conversation, solving the metrics problem that I've laid out really is consolidated into three things. You want to use the right framework, you want to present the right information, and you want to present the findings in the right context, the context being the business. So many people who think about cybersecurity are already thinking about it correctly, or they're thinking about it incorrectly, which is why I provided the definition. Most people, and I wore my hoodie on purpose, when you think about cybersecurity, they imagine somebody with all the lights off and they have their hood on and their face is illuminated by the screen. And that has no representation of the knowledge, the skill, or the excellence that security people are delivering to help the business make decisions and provide results that are going to be meaningful that help the business accomplish their goals. And so getting the business to understand what you're talking about, in part, that problem is solved by having a framework like factor analysis of information risk that communicates everything in terms that everybody understands. The next part is to identify what do I want to evaluate so that we're communicating the right thing, so that we're focusing on the right problem. The final item, when we talk about presenting the findings in the context, it's important to understand that your primary business impacts are financial impact, operational impact, regulatory impact, and reputation impact. All of my metrics and everything that I document has to be presented to the business related to what is going to happen to those four areas. And so if I combine my people, my processes, and my technology, and I understand the risk that applies to my organization, and I'm trying to drive the organization to address that risk properly, whether they're going to avoid it, accept it, mitigate it, or transfer it, they need to understand why are they doing this. Some organizations can withstand an operational outage, but are unwilling to accept a regulatory impact. Some organizations don't care about reputation whatsoever. Other organizations, it is the number one driver in all of their risk management decisions. As a cyber executive, it's important that you understand what the driver is so that when you're providing the information, you focus on what is going to cause the business to make the best decisions based on what's important to them. Now, the tool that I prefer, and I've been using this for quite a while, is NIST Special Publication 800-55. You notice that I keep referencing NIST documents. Again, not because they are the best, but because they're free and there is no cost for you to download them and start using them immediately. You'll see on the screen, if your resolution is large enough, that this document was printed in 2008, but it has continued to be a useful resource that provides a consistent way for describing security measurements and how those measurements apply to the business. The purpose of the document is to provide guidance about how an organization, through the use of metrics, is going to identify the controls that you have in place, the policies that exist, the procedures that exist, and the adequacy of those items. It serves the business no purpose to have a policy in place and it is inadequate to satisfy your confidentiality, availability, or integrity controls, or it serves no purpose to have a technical control in place that is inadequate to satisfy the requirement. And so your measurements that you collect using NIST 800-55 are going to provide an approach to help management decide where to invest in additional security resources, or it's going to help them identify and evaluate non-productive controls or even non-productive strategies. Once upon a time, I used the metrics produced from this approach to justify no longer spending money on data loss prevention, even though we spent a significant amount of revenue on the appliance, because when it came time to renew the contract or refresh the infrastructure, we were able to show that over that 3-year time frame, after we had spent the money, while we were going through the depreciation cycle and the technology was no longer useful, there was zero value produced for the money that we spent. Now, I could have just gone to the business and said, we spent a lot of money and it produced no value, but instead I had good measurements that documented the impact and the change in our security posture as a result of implementing the DOP appliance and the status of our security posture over time. And when we showed that there was no change, we didn't just keep the money and go shopping, but we reallocated those resources from continuing to spend on something that made no difference to spending on an area where we had limited resources and needed more dollars to improve the situation. And so one of the greatest benefits of having a standard approach for documenting your metrics is that they allow you to direct and manage resources and justify investments and spending in different security programs and in different initiatives. Now, the colorful diagram that is on my slide is not in the book. This was created to visually highlight some of the benefits of using the NIST 800-55. The greatest benefit that comes from this standard approach is that you have 3 different categories for categorizing your metrics. This helps you to align with the purpose of identifying poor performance and pointing to appropriate corrective action using the distinct types of measures. Another item that comes from NIST 800-55 is the description of the factors that allow you to consider whether you have interesting information or you have something that is a metric that allows you to direct resources and track performance. And so within the NIST 800-55, they give the qualities of good performance metrics, where the metric must be quantifiable, it must be readily obtainable, the process that you use to gather the metric should be repeatable, and you also have the ability to take the information that's produced and track your performance or direct resources, just as I described in the example that I provided. Once your good metrics are established, they need to be categorized, and these categorizations of implementation, effectiveness and efficiency, and impact allow you to communicate to the business and to your stakeholders what is the situation and what are we dealing with. Over the next series of slides, I will continue to reinforce the definition and the role of the different measurements, where implementation measures relate to the execution of your security program. Effectiveness and efficiency measures relate to the delivery of security services and the controls that you've put in place. And your impact measures relate to the impact on the business if there is a security consequence or a security event. Now, when you put all of this together, it provides a great concept that exists outside of security, but adds value to our conversation. And so if you think about the definition of visual acuity, and most people have seen the eye chart that measures at what line do you stop seeing the information, so we understand what is your prescription and how well are you seeing what you're looking at. And so the clarity of vision measured by one's ability to recognize small details with precision is a good overview of what we're talking about related to security metrics, because it's going to be a collection of small details that all work together to paint a good picture about the situation that we're dealing with for our security programs, our controls, and how effectively we are reducing or mitigating the risk of an attack, an incident, a data breach, or something else that's going to cause harm to the organization. Ultimately, the metrics that we're gathering are providing visual acuity for the business so that the business can make good decisions about the risks that they're facing, and then they can choose one of the 4 treatment options that reflects the priorities, the capability, and the resources that need to be applied to reduce risk to an acceptable level and keep it there. Ideally, the right metrics need to provide fact-based information about the situation. Earlier, I mentioned interesting information, and there is a difference between a metric and interesting information, where it is a fact, perhaps, that your firewall stopped 50 quadrillion attacks yesterday. The question, given a number so large, is how does that context matter to the organization? What is the difference between what happened yesterday and what happened today? Can we see something in the data that identifies that there is an increase in targeted attacks against us, or is that the baseline where 50 quadrillion is normal for our organization on a day-to-day basis? What's represented in that fact is that the numbers are not just numbers at a point in time, but is the measurement of that information over time that gives you context and helps you understand the situation that you're facing so that you can make the right decisions. And so if I'm presenting the right information, gathering metrics allows me to demonstrate with numbers that we are adequately providing the right security controls in place, or that we are failing to provide the right security controls. And we can observe that we're failing because of the number of outages, disruptions, incidents, or some kind of problem that we have within the organization. One of the great places to gather a lot of your security metrics is going to be in your security operations center, where you're performing event management and incident response. Very often, those activities are going to generate a lot of data about the effectiveness of your controls, because if you have ineffective controls, it increases the likelihood that you're going to have an event or an incident. Again, when you're documenting the metrics, you want to provide context by focusing on the operational, the financial, the regulatory, and the reputational impacts, but the number of impacts in each of those categories combined with the buckets of information that we're developing using NIST is going to allow you to very clearly explain to the business, we are doing well or we are doing poorly, protecting the organization for financial losses. Or you can say that we are doing well or we're doing poorly, protecting the organization from an operational outage that ultimately causes us to lose money, but the source of the financial loss comes from a failure in operations rather than something like business email compromise or another financial activity directly tied to the incident or the event. And so as you start to combine what we talked about in the previous session about risk management with the use of metrics to communicate, you are creating the opportunity for you to really talk about the adequacy of the risk treatment that you have provided for the organization. When you talk about adequacy, there are numerous ways to measure the effectiveness of the controls, and you're focusing on in-place controls and whether they are satisfying the requirements. And so, as I said before, encryption is your primary control for confidentiality. If our requirement is that only authorized individuals have access to personal information under specific circumstances, then all of the controls that we have in place, encryption at the network layer, encryption at the database layer, encryption on unstructured data that might be in a folder, access control that reinforces who is allowed to get access to the data. And then when you start getting really fancy and advanced, and you start doing certificate-based authentication so that only somebody who is part of my public key infrastructure, who has been authorized to have access to the data through something like, it slipped my mind, but there are all kinds of identity and access management strategies that are going to allow you to determine who can see the data, when can they see it, is it encrypted, can I unencrypt it, am I authorized to interact with it? This is what we're getting into when we talk about the adequacy of the controls. Very often your auditors are going to come and evaluate your controls for the sake of compliance. And so if I have ISO certification, or if I have NIST certification, or if I have PCI certification, all of those frameworks and all of those programs are going to look at my controls in a specific compliance context. My responsibility as a cyber executive is to make sure that all of the controls across the enterprise are documented, in place, and effectively satisfying the requirements that they were meant to satisfy. Now, when we talk about context, painting a picture with words is nice, but painting a picture with a picture is even more valuable. Pictures are good because they allow people to see a significant amount of information in an area or in a format that doesn't require you to go on and on and on. And so you can see in my pie chart on the left side of the slide that we can identify in quarter one, quarter two, quarter three, quarter four, what percent of our annual incidents existed. And so we can see in quarter one, based on the pie chart, that more than 50% of the incidents facing the organization happened in the first quarter of the year. Now, if we're gathering good metrics, we can say that the reduction in incidents from quarter one to quarter two, and then from quarter two to quarter three, and then quarter four having the lowest number of incidents probably relates to something that we did in the security program. Maybe we did not have an effective control in place, and not having that control caused us to have a significant number of security incidents. Then we put the control in place and the situation got better. The control matured, the situation gets even better. We increase maturity, the situation gets even better. And now you can visually see quarter over quarter that we have continued to improve the way that we're managing the environment simply by recording and presenting numerical information about our progress. Now, the challenge and the negative part related to a pie chart is that a pie chart only tells you information at a point in time. And so even though I used quarters to represent the data, we don't know how the data has changed or when the date of this, or what was the date that this was created. If this was done in 2018 and now it's 2020, the impact of the information is not as relevant as if this happened in 2020 and we're looking at Q4, but we're not at the end of Q4, so we don't know the total size or the total number of incidents that we're going to encounter. And so pie charts are popular in dashboards and in other reports to use it, or in other reports to represent data. The problem with the pie chart is that it's limited to a specific point in time, and it doesn't tell you how things are really changing over time, which takes us into the line chart. Now, the line chart spreads things out. You have a better understanding of one specific line related to the other lines, and you can visually see that things are going up and down and how they're moving. One of the benefits of the line chart is that you can add additional contextual data to describe what caused the spike or the dip. And so again, if you look at the blue line, we could say that the blue line is a measure of risk. And by doing something specific, risk was driven down from Q1 to Q2. The gold line could represent some kind of control that we put in place, and the effectiveness of the control has a relationship to the risk that we were experiencing. So control effectiveness goes up at the same rate that the risk that we're exposed to goes down. Now, what you see as we continue quarter over quarter is that as the control effectiveness starts to diminish, our risk starts to increase, and now we understand the relationship between all of the data simultaneously on a single chart. Now, the challenge with the line chart is that when you lose perspective as the volume of data increases or the time frame gets longer. And so here we're just looking at 3 data points, and we're only looking at it over 4 quarters, and the scale is only 6 points. But if you've ever worked in a security operations center, you could have millions of data points, and my millions of data points could be measured over an entire year, and 1 million data points over a year would make this chart very difficult to read. Similarly, the height of the scale, only being 0 to 6, does not do a good job to represent the rate of change or the impact of change compared to a line chart that represented the data on a scale of 0 to 100. So the numbers that you use in this format, whether it's a pie chart or a line chart, is going to make a big difference in the interpretation when the executives are looking at the data, and is often going to lead people to question your findings because you haven't done something properly. Which brings us to the histogram. I learned how to use histograms when I was at the Centers for Disease Control, again, because when you're doing public health work, the number of data points that they encounter is similar to the number of data points that you see in a security operations center. The reason that we're talking about all these charts and graphs and everything else is because the way that you tell the story and the way that you represent the data to the business is going to be meaningful, especially if you're presenting the data at a board meeting and many of your board members have financial backgrounds, they understand how to do statistical analysis, and they are potentially going to question the inputs that cause you to make an argument in the meeting. And so a histogram is a good tool when you have large data sets because it is a graphical representation that organizes a large group of data points into specific ranges. It's similar in appearance to a bar graph, but it condenses large quantities of data into something that is easy to interpret visually by taking all the data points and grouping them into bins. And so what you see in my example is we have distinct ranges of 1 to 5, 5 to 9, 9 to 13, and then everything that fits within that range is represented in the height of the bar, and the scale of the bars highlights that it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, and now we can see across the ranges, where does all of the data fall? Now, in reality, you would have a little more context to describe the numbers, what types of incidents we're talking about, what are we looking at, and we'll cover that in just a moment, but just your understanding of a histogram is valuable because there is a lot of data for you to look at in security, and representing all of that data properly is going to contribute to your success. Even if we were taking 3 different categories, like the ones that you have from the NIST 800-55, you can still divide each of the bars in the bar graph so that you can represent what % of the findings in this range applies to which one of the three categories. Another benefit of using a histogram is that for those of you who have more experience in statistical analysis, histograms allow you to apply concepts like moving, average, convergence, divergence, which allows you to identify a trend that follows an indicator that shows the relationship between moving averages. Thinking about moving averages is important because nothing in security is static, and the number of incidents that you see in November of 2020 is probably very different than what you saw in 2019, and is likely going to be very different from what you see in November of 2021. And so calculating the moving average so that it represents the reality is going to add context and add value to the way that you're presenting the data. When you're doing the histograms, there are multiple ways to lay out the distributions. And for people that understand what they're looking at, they can tell the trend visually simply by looking at the data. And so a normal distribution points to one side of the average, or items on one side of the average are as likely to occur as items on the other side of the average. If it's a binomial distribution, there are two peaks, and the data should be separated and analyzed as separate normal distributions. Sometimes you get a bimodal distribution when you average out the data over a long period of time, but the story that you're telling is more effective when you look at it in shorter time frames. And so maybe this distribution that's on the slide covers 12 months, but if I look at 6-month timeframes, I have a better understanding about the rise and the fall of statistics inside the metrics that I'm gathering for my security program. The right skewed distribution is represented as a positively skewed distribution, where a large number of values that start on the left lead to a reduction in a smaller number of values on the right. And visually, you can tell that the situation is getting better very quickly. We started with a very bad security program in the beginning. We put some controls in place. We grew the controls to maturity. The mature security controls allowed us to drastically reduce the risks that we were facing because the environment is very well under control. The opposite is a left skewed distribution, and depending on what you're measuring, you're going to want to drive things up or you want to drive them down. And so the measurements that you're focusing on are going to affect the value of the distribution. If we're talking about risk, a right skewed distribution is positive because risk is reducing. If we're talking about risk with the left skewed distribution, it means that the situation is getting worse and we need to take some kind of remedial action because the number of items is going up over time. A random distribution simply represents that there is no apparent pattern. There are several peaks and the data could be separated and analyzed independently because when you look at it as a whole, it doesn't tell a specific story. Now, all of this leads into something else that you're likely going to encounter when you're dealing with metrics and measurements and reporting. And it's the idea of standard deviation that talks about the variation or how much you have dispersed a set of values in a time frame for a population of data. Generally, when you're dealing with standard deviation, it's the measure of the amount of variation of a set of values, where most of your values are going to fall close to the mean, and 68% of your data is going to hover around the average. Where this becomes valuable is that a low standard deviation indicates that everything is normal, but something that is multiple deviations from the mean identifies an outlier. And so if I'm gathering consistent metrics and everything is normal, the farther away from the mean the data is, the more abnormal and volatile the situation. And so if I have some security metric that ends up 3 standard deviations from the mean, then that is statistically significant and requires additional attention and investigation. This could be an indication of a key risk indicator where we have set an upper boundary and a lower boundary, and anything above 2 standard deviations or negative 2 standard deviations is going to immediately trigger an incident ticket because it is so far away from normal that we need to investigate it. Maybe our tools didn't detect it, but we can tell from our statistical analysis that there is a problem that requires our attention. And so this is what allows you to define the measure of volatility, because anything inside the, or anything that's concentrated in that 68% close to the mean is going to be normal. And everything that starts to fall outside of those numbers is going to allow you to say, hey, we need to jump into action. Now, if you tie this to the low, moderate, high ratings of risk that you normally have in a security program, low risk is going to be everything that falls within one standard deviation. Moderate risk is going to start to encompass those things that fall into the 89% range, and then anything above 89%, when you get to 3 standard deviations from the mean, is going to be in the high risk range and is going to drive you to immediately jump into action. Now, what I'm describing in a security context is the same thing that financial analysts do for stocks, for bonds, and for trading. And so this is not something new. This is a new application of a long-standing practice that is going to give you better abilities to respond to inputs and data that you're gathering, collecting, and analyzing. Now, with that said, and I saw the question that came in, I'll come back to it in a moment if we had time. But with that said, when you think about the way that you're going to measure the data and the way that you're going to represent it, the right metrics documented in the right format are going to help drive the right business decisions. Again, when I'm gathering my metrics, they need to be quantifiable, readily obtainable. The process that I use to capture the data needs to be repeatable, and the measure should be useful for tracking performance and directing resources. As you'll see in the next examples, I have an example of each category, and they're going to show how metrics can help you communicate the value of security within your organization. One, we'll start with your implementation measures. When you're demonstrating value with the implementation measures, you want to remember that implementation measures are used to measure the execution of security programs, controls, and associated policies and procedures. A good example of this is going to be when you initially deploy your information security management system. As soon as I deploy the ISMS, I want to start to record data so I understand the impact that that ISMS has had on the environment. Now, in an ideal sense, I wanted to be gathering metrics beforehand, but most organizations that don't have a security management system also don't have a metrics program, so we do want to be realistic. But if I'm going to start gathering metrics, as soon as I implement my information security management system, I now can start to ask, how do metrics communicate the value and the quality of the security program or of my ISMS? The measurement of the full program is the result of aggregating the metrics for each component. And so within an information security management system, you have different control families, you have different requirements. We could be talking about access control. We could be talking about encryption, vendor management, patch management. Everything that makes up your security management system is going to have its own individual collection of control of metrics for each collection of controls. And then the aggregate data from all of that combined now allows you to measure the entire security program supported by the management system. By gathering metrics, you are in the position to now demonstrate that failing to patch systems and services in a timely manner can cause outages, disruptions, and security incidents related to vulnerabilities that could have been addressed. And so if we use an example in the US, I think the Equifax had one of the largest data breaches in the world in 2018. It took them almost a year to clean everything up and get everything fixed. They fired a lot of people, replaced a lot of people. But that data breach was significant simply because they had an unpatched web server. And so if you think about patching as part of your security program, documented in your information security management system, Equifax is a good example, but is not the only example. Many of the data breaches that have happened in the last 6 months, even with things like Heartbleed, are unpatched systems that if the patch was in place or if some mitigating control was in place, the issue wouldn't have happened. This is reinforced by research from the Australian Signals Directorate, which said, I think it was in 2017 or 18, that up to 85% of targeted attacks are mitigated simply by doing application whitelisting, limiting administrative privileges, and patching systems in a timely manner. Now, obviously, timely is going to vary from organization to organization, but imagine if we had a corporate policy that said we are going to patch everything within a reasonable time frame when patches are available. And at the governance level, because we've talked about the tiered organizational hierarchy, at the governance level, they have said that systems that have, or vulnerabilities that have a high rating are going to be patched within 10 days. Vulnerabilities that have a moderate rating are going to be patched within 30 days. Vulnerabilities that have a low rating are going to be patched within 90 days. Now with that, I have the basis for doing metrics and statistical analysis simply by looking at, are we following the program requirements for patching within the organization? Now I can start to look into the details. Are 100% of the systems compliant? How many exceptions were approved? Because there is always an exception to the policy. When we look at the root cause of incidents that are reported and managed by our incident response team and by our security operations center, how many of those incidents would have been prevented if the unpatched system was patched according to the requirements in the program? Then on top of that, we can start to think about our other categories. What was the financial impact of the event? What was the operational impact of an unpatched system for which a patch exists? What was the regulatory impact? What was the reputational impact? When I start to collect all of the data for all of the program requirements, I have a very good understanding about how well the program is working to reduce the risk the organization is facing. Now, most security programs don't start with 100% compliance. And so that's where you get the distributions that I showed you in the previous slide with the histograms. What you're likely to see is that you start low, and as you mature in your practices and your procedures and in the execution of the program's requirements, hopefully you will get closer and closer and closer to 100%, where 100% of the time you're patching these systems in the time frame that was identified, and by patching the systems, you're reducing the risk that you are going to encounter within the organization. Now, one thing to consider about the implementation measures is that measurement of your security program is going to focus very heavily on the controls initially, and then as a maintenance activity, a lot of your control measures are going to shift into the effectiveness and efficiency category rather than solely being considered as part of your implementation. You imagine if I had an information security management system for the last decade, I'm really focused more on the effectiveness of the security program as a whole, rather than the individual controls when we're looking at implementation, because the program has already been implemented and we're just monitoring the program overall to make sure that it continues to satisfy our requirements. This leads us into the efficiency and the effectiveness measures specifically. And again, there is an opportunity to demonstrate value. If I'm demonstrating value with my effectiveness and efficiency measures, I'm focused on our security controls specifically and how well they've been implemented. Effectiveness focuses on the robustness of the result produced by the control. For example, if I put multi-factor authentication in place and my multi-factor authentication is using digital certificates as part of a public key infrastructure system, that is much more robust than using username and password to provide access to critical systems. And so there is a methodology where you can describe how robust is the control that we have implemented, and effectiveness is the word that we're using. Efficiency describes the timeliness of the result of having the security control in place. These two combined start to describe the quality of the controls that we've implemented so that we reduce risk to the acceptable level and we maintain risk at that level that was designated. And so our efficiency and effectiveness measures are going to help us monitor if program level processes and system level security controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and meeting the desired outcome. Most of the time when you're evaluating technical controls, those three criteria are going to be very important. I'll repeat it again just in case somebody is a good student and you're taking notes. Whenever you are evaluating a technical security control, the three criteria that you want to verify are that the control is implemented correctly, it's operating as intended, and meeting the desired outcome. And this is exactly what we're looking at with effectiveness and efficiency measures. These requirements, the three that I listed, are often the basis for evaluating all of your controls in the environment, and they concentrate on the evidence and the results of any kind of assessment that was performed. And so when my QSA comes in for PCI, they're verifying that all of my PCI requirements are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and meeting the desired outcome. If I use the NIST cybersecurity framework to identify, detect, protect, respond, and recover to cybersecurity attacks and incidents, my evaluation of the controls from the cybersecurity framework are going to focus on whether or not each of the individual controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and meeting the desired outcome. Gathering the right metrics is the beginning of the process, and it allows you to think about the robustness and the timeliness of controls like privilege access management, multi-factor authentication, and user access review if we just stay in the neighborhood of identity and access management, but it's going to apply to all of the controls that you have in the environment. Now, if we're just focusing on our identity and access management controls, if they're in place, effective, and satisfying the requirements, we have a high degree of confidence that we're going to limit or prevent unauthorized access to the environment, which is also going to let us have a high degree of confidence that we have not had any data breaches or that we've not had any compromises of personal information. Effectiveness and efficiency measures provide information for decision makers about the results of previous policy and acquisition decisions. If we put a policy in place and we're reinforcing the policy with technical controls, and we discover that the technical controls that we put in place are not producing the outcome that we've expected, we can use the metrics that we're gathering to reevaluate. One, was this the right policy? Two, are the technical controls implemented properly to achieve the outcome? I gave the example earlier about data loss prevention as an appliance going back in the day before it was integrated into things like Microsoft 365 and other solutions. And so now I also have the ability to use my metrics to evaluate, was this the right acquisition? And when it comes time to renew the solution, do we want to renew the contract or the agreement, or do we want to change technology because I have data that helps me justify the decisions that we're making? Now, your effectiveness and efficiency measures may require combining or fusing data from the information security program, the activities within the program, and data that is obtained from automated monitoring tools. Most often, this is going to be a significant amount of data about all of the controls and any automation that you can put in place to monitor, track, and document your results is going to be valuable. In a couple of slides, I have a tool that I recommend that, again, is complementary and is going to contribute to your success. But trying to do this manually is very difficult. It can get to be a lot of data, especially for those of you who have robust security control catalogs. You have a lot of controls in place. And now I'm asking you to gather multiple metrics about each one of those controls tied to the objectives of your security program. Now, one other item to consider is that if you do not have a framework within your organization to describe the maturity of your controls, the maturity of a security control can be evaluated according to the properties in the P6 model. The relationship between effectiveness and efficiency is very closely tied to the maturity of controls. You usually have an effective and efficient control if the control is maturely implemented. And so if you use the P6 maturity model and you have documented how you have satisfied all of these requirements, achieving 100% of each of these goals is going to produce a fully mature control. 10% of the control's maturity is based on people, where you're answering the question, has a control owner been named, and is the control owner equipped and knowledgeable to make sure that the control functions properly? Sometimes the CIO is the control owner. Sometimes security is the control owner. Sometimes you have a third party who owns the control, but identifying, documenting, and verifying that the control owner knows who they are and what their responsibilities are is very important. The policies makes up another 10% of the maturity of a control, and policy is focused on whether or not the control enforces a specific policy in the environment. You can tell in our conversation that we always want to tie technical controls to a documented policy that describes what people should do in conjunction with procedures and guidelines that say how to do it and providing additional information so that you're successful. Procedures often require some kind of standard operating procedure. And so if we have a incident response as a control, because there is an incident response family of controls, both in ISO and in NIST, you should have standard operating procedures that say, when we have a data breach, this is how we're going to respond. If there's a ransomware attack, we have formal step-by-step procedures that say how to respond and provide containment, eradication, and recovery for the ransomware attack, or the distributed denial of service, or a drive-by download because somebody went to a website. All of those things that you can conceive of related to the control should have formal documented procedures. And if they do, that adds another 15% to your calculation of the maturity of the control. When you talk about processes focused on where the control fits within a closed loop framework that engages in the organization's defense in depth strategy. So if you look at something like the COSO framework, they have deterrent, preventive, detective, and corrective controls that describe multiple layers of defense. If you have adopted a strategy like COSO, or you have that layered defense in depth model, there should be some formal documentation about where this specific control fits within the defense in depth model so that you understand the upstream and downstream dependencies. This is going to lead to knowledge and understanding of the impact of a control failure and how the control works in conjunction with other controls in the organization to achieve your risk management outcomes. On the product side, the objective is focused on whether or not the control is automated. There are many controls that require human input, but to the extent that you can automate the function and the execution of the control is going to perform faster, better, and more consistently than something that depends on a person to perform the control function. Early in my career, when I worked in a security operations center and I was doing incident response, I remember the days before we had security information and event management, and even to an extent before we really had mature log management solutions, and using Control F in a very large text file with no carriage returns, and it was just a big blob of data. My manual analysis of the text file as a log from a system was much less efficient than what people have available today using your security information and event management solutions. And so the priority and the highlight, you see that it makes up a significant part of the maturity, is that to the extent possible, you want your controls to be automated so that you have confidence in how consistently they perform their requirements. Our conversation is about metrics, and when you look at the proof is just a question about whether or not metrics and key performance indicators are used to measure the performance and effectiveness of the control. And so we're almost satisfying the proof requirement by incorporating the 6 properties from the P6 maturity model into our evaluation of effectiveness and efficiency measures. But this P6 model works for any kind of control, not just for security controls and not just in the context that we're talking about. The final category is impact measures, and this is the area that is most often going to be interesting to the business. The role of the impact measures is to measure the business or mission consequences of a security event. And so when your business counterpart or your stakeholder walks up to you and says, "Are we secure?" the answer to the question is, let's look at the impact measures in our metrics and reporting program, and I can tell you the specific measurable results of our security programs related to the impact of security incidents and events that we've realized. So these measures are inherently organization specific. Gartner cannot tell you what's in the magic quadrant For metrics, it's got to be something that you look internally to say what's important to the business, what is going to communicate value, how does this align with strategic objectives. One of the benefits of having these impact measures is that the impact measures are the best metrics to quantify cost savings produced by the security program. So if you say that we avoided a costly security event because we have effective controls, that is a business justification to continue investing in the security program. Or you can quantify the public trust gained or maintained by having a good security program, which is going to contribute to a positive reputation instead of having your reputation damaged because you had a security incident that could have been avoidable, but you didn't invest properly to avoid it. So again, the impact measures provide the most direct insight into the value of the security of the organization and are often the metrics that are most often sought by corporate executives and business leaders. Now, if the business leaders are only focusing on the impact measures, the other measures are going to be things that you use internally as the risk leader, and then the impact measures is what you're going to report to the board of directors or to your senior executive staff when they're asking about the security program itself. Related to the impact measures, again, repeating our theme, gathering the right metrics is going to allow you to demonstrate with numbers that you're failing, that you're successful, that improvement needs to be made. We can use that for things as simple as security awareness training, which helps you avoid outages, disruptions, and incidents related to phishing attacks. It's documented by the Anti-Phishing Working Group, by KnowBe4, and by all kinds of organizations that being the victim of phishing is one of the top sources of user-generated compromises in a business. We also know in advance that just regular security awareness training, helping users understand the method and the frequency and the context of phishing messages is going to help them not be a victim. And so we could leverage this knowledge that we have about phishing, both the impact and the methodology, and use that to describe specific metrics that relate to the effectiveness of our security controls and how well they're stopping an incident from occurring. You can ask questions like how many people completed training. If 100% of our workforce completed training, that is likely going to drive down the number of user-generated incidents that result from phishing. I think the best statistic I heard, a colleague of mine does phishing training and exercises and covert simulations. I think they said they do it once every quarter. And so training all the time and always introducing people to new information and sharing with them, still the best they can do with their phishing program is to have 10% of the population still clicks on a link. It's not the same 10% of the people, but their baseline metric is that if 90% of their employees are avoiding phishing, then that's within the normal range. And now they just focus on what to do for that remaining 10% in terms of layered defenses and other mitigating controls. But they understand this information because of the metrics that they've been gathering. Another metric to consider is that when analyzing the root cause of an incident, how many user-generated incidents would have been addressed if the people had taken the training, and did the training content address what led to the incident? In the United States and globally, October was Cybersecurity Awareness Month. And so everywhere around the world, people were focusing on security awareness training and increasing the awareness of individuals working within the organizations. This is a good time to now look at your metrics and see, after Cybersecurity Awareness Month, have the number of phishing incidents decreased? For the people that are clicking on the links in the messages or falling victim to scams, how many of those people did not take the training? And can we now use people who didn't take the training has a relationship to the number of incidents that we're seeing in the environment? Other questions to ask if we're going to go this route are, what is the financial impact to the organization if somebody does not take training that is available, that addresses the situation, that leads to a financial loss, or leads to an operational outage, or leads to a regulatory impact because somebody tricks a person in human resources to send a database of customer information, or any other situation, but it all measures how impactful is it to our organization when we have a security incident, and how well are our controls preventing that? We could look with the email conversation more specifically at things like business email compromise, and are we doing role-based security awareness training for people who work in corporate financial services so that they do not wire millions of dollars to offshore accounts that can't be recovered? Preventing that type of successful attack is simply a matter of communication and training, and we can measure the effectiveness of our training by gathering metrics. Now, I mentioned before that there was a tool that was going to help you automate the evaluation of all of your controls. If you have not encountered it, NIST has an open security controls assessment language that helps you document and represent your controls in XML, JSON, and YAML formats, which now allows communication between your infrastructure and your control catalogs and your GRC solutions so that you can automate the collection process that helps you standardize data collection and reporting about the efficiency and the effectiveness of the controls that you have in place. The OSCAL, also known as OSCAL, allows the development of machine-readable representations of control catalogs. You can document control baselines. You can document system security plans. And instead of somebody typing behind the keyboard and filling this out in a Word document, you can create an environment where the state, status, and effectiveness of the control is ingested as data off of the infrastructure that provides the control in the first place. So if it's a multi-factor authentication solution, we can use OSCAL to ingest data that talks about how well that control is working. Or if it's an encryption solution, then we can ingest the data. All of those technical controls, they can function and export data in XML, JSON, or YAML, are potentially going to be things that you can build into this model so that you have automated control-based assessments of the things that you've deployed in your environment to manage risk. Now, we mentioned in the threat agent risk assessment conversation in the previous module before the break that there is a large universe of possible attack scenarios. There is also a large universe of possible metrics that you could gather. I said before that when I was at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, when I left in 2014, we had almost 1,000 distinct information systems that were made up of servers, information and communications technology, data, systems that were deployed all over the place. And those 1,000 systems were used by 85,000 people in 50 countries. And so if I gathered metrics about all of that, the systems, the people, the countries, the data, the controls on all the systems, I really could have trillions of data points. And so one thing to consider if you don't already have a metrics program in place is that you want to start small, establish consistency, and then build upon your success. You could take each of the control families from the ISO 27002 and identify 3 high priority measures per category in the control catalog to help you get started with your program. The initial measures should have the following qualities or attributes. You should pick things that are going to allow you to improve high priority security controls or objectives. You should focus on using data that can realistically be obtained from existing sources. For example, if you have a GRC system in place or some other inventory, that the existence of that item is going to contribute to you getting started with your metrics program. You also want to make sure that you're measuring processes that already exist and are established, because it's hard to do metrics on new things if you've never done a metrics program to begin with. Now, some organizations are going to use a weighting scale so that they can differentiate the importance of selected metrics. Some metrics are going to be less important than others, and so the context that you provide with the weighting is going to help prioritize the things that you report to the business, what you communicate, and what people are going to care about. All of this effort is going to help you integrate security measures into your processes for budgeting, decision-making, capital planning, acquisitions of new technology, and even additional headcount, because you can demonstrate with the numbers that you're recording that you are doing well, that you're doing poorly, or that improvements need to be made. Another item to consider as we get close to the end is that your measurement should be documented in a consistent and standardized format. If you ask for a copy of the slides, what is important to consider is that the examples that I have on this slide are just examples. There is no official standard for what you're going to record, but this is a good starting point for building out the framework for documenting all of your metrics. What you can imagine is that I'm going to put it in an XML table. I'm going to put it into some kind of web system where it's a form fill, or you could customize it and integrate it into your GRC solutions if you have that level of flexibility. But creating an ID for the measurement so that you can track and sort, tying the measurement to some strategic goal or security goal or initiative. The measurement is going to describe how you're using this metric specifically. Is it a percentage? Is it a number? Is it a frequency? Is it an average? The type of metric is focused on whether it's implementation, effectiveness and efficiency, or impact. The formula is going to provide the calculation that you use to generate the numeric result. Again, that's going to tie to the measurement category. The target is going to be the range that is acceptable. So if we say that in the case with my friend that has the security awareness training program, it's acceptable for them that 90% of the workforce does not fall victim to a phishing campaign because they've done the training. And so now 90% is the lower boundary, 100% is the upper boundary. Anything that falls within that target is going to be acceptable. Setting the target is valuable, especially if you are a risk leader, not just an individual contributor, because it allows you to tie your metrics to your key risk indicators that communicate risk information in conjunction with security information. So if we say the upper boundary for something is 50% and the lower boundary is 30%, anything that falls outside those ranges should trigger some kind of alert or investigation related to risk management, because the metrics are representing that you're not maintaining things at an acceptable level. Your frequency is just how often am I collecting the metric. Some things like security awareness training, if you do it annually, you don't need to collect it every day. Other things like the metrics related to your technical security controls might be something that you do daily. The metrics that you're describing are going to help you identify what is the right frequency. What I would argue is that responsible parties, where it's not a requirement, is very valuable if you can document the information owner who has the information that needs to be collected, the information collector, who is the person that's responsible to collect the data, and the information customer that identifies who is going to receive the data. If you are in a large, robust organization, different people are going to fulfill different roles, and documenting who's responsible for what part in the process when I'm gathering, collecting, and reporting the information is going to be valuable. Similarly, the data source is often very helpful if I can identify where am I getting this information from. Is it a database? Is it a tracking tool? Is it the OSCAL for NIST? All of that is going to add some value. Another area to look at is just the reporting format. Pie charts are an option, line charts are an option. I still recommend a histogram because that's the best way to consolidate a lot of information into a small format. And so in closing, I've carried on for quite a while and I appreciate the attention that you guys paid for this session. The benefits of using the right metrics to communicate the right information and the right context serves a couple of purposes that are worth noting. One is going to increase accountability. If we have good security measurements, we can identify specific controls that are implemented incorrectly, that are not implemented and are not effective, and then we can make changes. If we're doing everything that we need to do with our metrics program, we can improve the effectiveness of information security overall because we clearly see what's not working and now we can take corrective action. We can also demonstrate compliance with our metrics because I can't tell you how many times an auditor has come, performed an audit, and has asked for evidence that we're doing what we said we're doing. And so if I use the results produced by my metrics program to demonstrate compliance with PCI, for example, where requirement 5 in PCI says that I have to have antivirus on all of the infrastructure in the card processing network. Now we have the efficiency and the effectiveness measurement as a category, and we're measuring what percent of the infrastructure has antivirus. If it's 100%, and we're gathering this information over time, I can generate a report of the efficiency and the effectiveness of my antivirus control and say that 100% of the time, 100% of my systems have antivirus installed, configured properly, functioning effectively, and producing the expected result. And now when my QSA comes to do my PCI assessment, I just hand them whatever report that needs to be generated. And I've been gathering the evidence over time, so everybody's happy. There's also, because QSAs are expensive, this is going to reduce the cost because they have to spend less time looking for data. My final item in terms of closing thoughts and just the value of the metrics program is that if you gather good metrics, the best outcome that I've seen personally is good data allows you to justify spending. If I can communicate to the business in specific terms based on the information that we're gathering that our security program is not working, I need more money to solve this problem because my efficiency and my effective measurements say that we're doing poorly in a specific area, whether it's encryption, whether it's access control, whether it's vendor management, whatever that area is, I now have evidence to justify my budget request, and the business is not going to assume that I'm just making up numbers because I need more money. And so with that, in the interest of time, again, we do corporate training. This is not a sales pitch, but I was limited in how deep we could go into the examples. And if you were not here for the first session, and this is the first experience that you've had with this conversation, if you send me an email or if you choose to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides. Moldova Cyber Week 2020 will also give you a copy of the slides. They have PDF copies of the slides from me. And so either option works. At this time, if you guys have any questions, I'm happy to explore them. I tried to answer the questions that came in the chat as we were going, but if there's anything else, I still have time.
Keyaan.
Yes, ma'am.
Wonderful. And you see, you still have so many people. At 5 o'clock, usually we finish the working day, but probably we have participants from other countries and they're still enjoying your presentation.
Well, I'm glad they enjoyed it. I'm happy to come back and to do it again at another session. Metrics is something that I talk about regularly. I'm just a bit of a statistics nerd, so it helps to be a nerd sometimes.
I think you provided a lot of information, and I'm sure we'll come back and we will read because there's plenty of information, and we will discuss maybe in the future we can do some other webinars or maybe conferences or seminars for a specific public.
Absolutely. We started this early in the day for me since I'm in the US, but this is something that I'm very excited about. So anybody who has any questions, again, please feel free to send me an email, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm attached to Moldova Cyber Week. So as long as you guys are willing to have me, I'll continue to come back for the conference and for any other things that you're doing.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much on behalf of our team. I thank you again, and we will come back to you with some logistical details. And right now, we wish you a great day. I guess it's what time it is now?
It's 10 o'clock on Thanksgiving Day, so I'm going to take a nap and then I'll eat a turkey.
Oh, thank you so much. I know it's a big holiday, as I said yesterday in the stage. Thanks a lot for double effort, and we stay in touch. And I thank you all participants for staying with us until now. And tomorrow, looking forward for another webinars. So for those who are interested, please check the website and see you tomorrow. Keyaan, have a nice day and happy Thanksgiving Day.
Thank you very much. You all take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, talk to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.